alternatives. And then recently in May, we provided a memo to City Council that described the alternatives and suggested which alternatives we would move forward. So this evening we have Matt Fink and his team with CDOT, and he will introduce his team, and then they will present the alternatives, and they will explain which ones they want to move forward with for conceptual design. So I guess go ahead, Matt. Hey, Matt, it looks like you're muted.
Sorry about that. I'll start over. Again, my name is Matt Fink. I'm the project manager for CDOT for this project. As you may know, we've hired David Evans and Associates for the design. On the phone with me today, we have Ryan Sorensen from CDOT. He's the resident engineer for this project. Stacy Shore from David Evans and Associate is our traffic engineer. Velvet Kiesel is from David Evans and Associate is the project manager, and Leah Langerman from David Evans is our public involvement expert. Today we'll be going through the final design alternatives real quick and providing an explanation for each alternative. We ask, if possible, to please hold the questions until after Stacy's done with her short presentation, if possible. And with that, I'll go ahead and kick it over to Stacy Shore from David Evans.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for your time today. I am going to talk using a document that we sent you called Alternatives Development and Draft Evaluation Results. Does everyone have that document, or would you like me to share my screen to go over it? Maybe I'll share my screen. Is that okay? Does that work for everybody? Okay. Give me a second. Okay. Can everybody see my PDF now? Okay. So this is the document that I'm going to use to talk through what we've done. So we evaluated 6 alternatives at 60th and 4 alternatives at 62nd and Vasquez. In the end, we recommended a combination of 3 alternatives at 60th and Vasquez and 1 alternative at 62nd. Those we recommend to move forward with concept design as well as more detailed evaluation. So we decided to focus on a couple questions that we've heard from the city with the limited time that we have. First is the reason for not moving forward with the quadrant road alternative. So this alternative was brought up during our brainstorming session with our team, and it includes removing all left turns from the 60th and Vasquez intersection. So there would be no left turns at this intersection. So it was brought up because this type of intersection with a signal makes this main signal a 2-phase signal. And sometimes the better operations you get from that outweigh the out of direction travel from the turns plus additional signal. But that's not what we found here. While we found moderate delay reduction, especially on Vasquez with the 2-phase signal, we found that the left turns had a lot of impact. For example, the southbound left from Vasquez to 60th as well as to Parkway that can make that movement now would have to come down, turn right, it's the orange line here, come to the quadrant road, turn left, go around the quadrant road, turn left again onto Vasquez, and then turn right onto 60th and Parkway. And the westbound left from 60th, those are the 2 highest left turn movements, would have to go straight through the intersection, turn left onto the quadrant road, and then turn right at the new signal. So both of those are quite a bit of out of direction travel. Also, the fact that we had to add a signal on Vasquez close to the I-270 interchange and the construction impacts on Vasquez close to the I-70 interchange and the right-of-way impacts of the new Quadrant Road were really the reason behind the elimination or not moving that alternative forward. So our recommended, especially when we compare it to our recommended alternative. So our recommended alternative is actually a combination, so putting together the three alternatives that we showed in this initial evaluation. So including the short-term technology and safety improvements, including the parkway restricted left out, and the improved frontage road system. So with the more detailed evaluations that we've done since our initial recommendations, I wanted to note first that we've already decided to keep the southeast frontage road connection as is. So the way it is now in this southeast corner. And that is because of the impacts of closing that would have to the bus route that currently comes this way and serves these really busy bus stops at this location. So looking at the west frontage roads, as well as the overall alternative. So the overall alternative with that included closure of these west frontage road connection cuts the overall delay at the intersection in half in the AM peak hour, so in the morning, and by about 40% in the PM peak hour. And in the morning, the southbound queues, so without this alternative, they would back up to almost the merge from Highway 2 that comes in. With this alternative, we show the queues reducing to just in this area. So just in front of the Walgreens. So going from 45 to 50 cars queued up in the southbound direction to going to, you know, a little more than 10 to 15 cars. And then in the PM, looking at the westbound queues, which are high in the PM, going from almost back to this signal at the Walmart signal there to only 10 cars in this area right in front of the Grease Monkey. So as you can see, the alternative itself provides quite a bit of benefits. And those benefits are from removing the signal phases. So the signal phase for the parkway left out is removed, as well as the signal phase for those west frontage roads, the movements out of those frontage roads into the intersection. And that's really where those operational benefits come from. The in movements have impacts that are not captured in an operational model. There's conflicts and there's safety issues. It doesn't capture things like the slower turns that have to happen to make that movement. But all of those conflicts will only get worse as traffic increases with the 270 improvements, as well as the Mile High development. So we have looked at it a little further, and this is kind of a zoom in so you can see more of these west frontage roads. Now with the new development of the Starbucks in the southwest corner, that will likely create more conflicts if this south frontage road connection is kept open. From the volumes wanting to go into Starbucks, as well as just the queues coming in and out of Starbucks. Also, the increase in pedestrians that we often see with a development specifically like Starbucks. And really, the goal is to also improve pedestrian connections and safety. So that was part of the goals that we looked at with our analysis. And this shows the existing multi-stage crossing that occurs across the north leg of the intersection. So right now, there's only enough time for a person to cross each one of these red arrows to cross from one side of Vasquez to the other. And so somebody has to push this button, cross here, stand in the middle of Vasquez, push the button again, come over, push the button again to cross the west frontage road. So that is because to give as much time as possible to Vasquez, because each of those movements stops the Vasquez green time. So removing this connection on the west side will really give Vasquez more time and reduce delay impacts when someone does come and push that button. And as we get more pedestrians crossing and the goal of providing that pedestrian connection, that will be more apparent, those conflicts of pedestrians as they cross. And as well as just physically, if this connection is not here altogether, it removes that conflict. It removes the conflict just inherent from vehicular conflict between vehicle and vehicles, as well as pedestrians and vehicles. And also just generally improves the pedestrian connection and comfort and safety. So that really, in a nutshell, goes through our summary of what we looked at and our key components of our recommendations, as well as some more information on what we've focused on as we've moved ahead just in the last few weeks with some more detailed evaluation. So we can open up to questions, or unless Matt has anything to add.
No, we can go ahead and open it up.
Okay.
Anybody have questions for the CDOT representatives? You guys can unmute yourself. Councilmember Dara.
Yeah, so, this is a great plan and all, but we recently lost at Walgreens, and a large part of it was access. So if we were to do this, would it be possible to, instead of having that frontage road, make it more of a right in, right out only, and having that run all the way through on the west side frontage road? And that way you'd have room to queue for 270, which causes a lot of the backup in the evening hours and in the AM hours where those cars have nowhere to queue. So they're going all the way past the light on 60th, southbound or northbound, sorry. And so because, seeing this plan, I think, what would be the plan? Just block it off with some cinder blocks, or would it still be in access?
So the intent, like I said, so the biggest benefit that you get is not having the movement out. So people coming out of the frontage roads, entering 60th and Vasquez.
Yeah, I understand the benefit.
So that doesn't have a phase, and that provides the best connection, the best improvement. If you wanted to provide a right out, that might be okay because they're not entering, into, they don't get a phase then, especially like the southbound right out where it's coming out, not going into the 60, but it's not going to get you, the volume there is very low.
So what I was saying is combining it with 85 traffic for Vasquez, right? So removing that median that separates the frontage road from Vasquez and combining it as extra lanes to Vasquez. So now you have right lanes to enter the businesses.
Okay, sorry, I didn't understand your.
Another phase because now it's combined with that Vasquez phase.
Right. That would not meet the access requirements of Vasquez as it's classified and the access along there. Having a driveway that close to the intersection on Vasquez itself is part of the reason why the frontage roads, were left there in the first place.
Thank you so much for this. And if everybody looks at all of the attachments, it's very impressive what you've gone through just to get to this point. But I have a question about three questions. How pedestrians get across Vasquez? I didn't understand that. It looked like they still have to stop all the way across. And number two, how you prioritized. Was it when you look at pedestrians, commercial, commercial vehicles, regular vehicles, who was taking top priority in these changes? And then thirdly, do you have a cost estimate? And subpart to that is how are we dividing the expenses on that?
Okay. Let me try to remember the three different ones.
I'll help.
So the first one,
How do pedestrians get across
Yeah.
Vasquez?
yeah. So let me share this again. Can you see my little diagram again? Okay. So, oh no, sorry. I always forget to hit share. Okay. So right now they have to cross here, but let's say they get here, they cross the right turn lane or over here, and they're at the little island. They have to press the button, wait, and then cross, and then press the button and wait and cross, and then press the button and wait and cross, unless they just dive across and don't wait, because at that point they don't care, right? So the difference is when we take out this connection altogether, this crossing doesn't have to be provided, because that would just be all area for pedestrians. They end right here. So while they still either have to do the 2-stage across Vasquez, or it's more likely that then we can provide a single stage crossing to give people enough time to get all the way across, because of all the other improvements that we've made. If we can get rid of the phase for the out of the frontage roads, as well as the left out from Parkway, that will give us enough cushion in the capacity of the overall intersection to be able to look at providing the full time to get across these two pieces. But when you add another need for another 30 seconds to get across this piece, that's when it just becomes overwhelming. So you're going from a 3-stage crossing to at least a 2, if not maybe a 1-stage crossing.
Okay, good. Then
Does that make sense?
when you were making a decision on what to recommend, how did you prioritize pedestrians, commercial vehicles, regular vehicles, etc.? Getting in and out of the shopping centers and so forth.
So these were the criteria. So you can see pedestrian safety, like connections, the freights. All of these are vehicular, travel time, delay, queue lengths. These were all of the criteria that we did in our matrix. We did not prioritize or do any kind of math where we said the freight is twice as important as the regular vehicles or anything like that. We basically put all of it in the way for each of the criteria, and then looked at overall as a holistic alternative, which was providing the best balance of the criteria. So there was nothing that was a fatal flaw necessarily, but there was also nothing that was the number one thing that would, like, this gives the absolute best operations, so we're going to do that no matter what. So neither of those things were done.
Okay, thank you. And then about costs. How do the costs break down?
Construction costs were considered. So they were at a conceptual level developed for each of the alternatives as seen here, as shown in each of these. They considered, high level construction costs. And then we looked at kind of in comparison to each other, high, moderate, low construction costs as far as weighing against each other. And like I said, it's if something was the highest construction cost, it wasn't necessarily a fatal flaw, but it was considered in the balance of everything else. So part of what we're doing is, as we move forward with a more detailed evaluation, that's when we get into really looking at more detail the costs and the types of agreements that would need to occur.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question, and thank you, Stacy, for your presentation again. But has it ever been explored, like the possibility of a bridge to go across, like the highway, a bridge, for pedestrian safety?
Yeah, we were focused on what we called shorter term improvements that would provide substantial improvements with what we would say funding within the funding that would be able to be be obtained within the funding that we have. So with that, really structures like interchange and things like that, we're taking out. Now, a pedestrian structure is something that could be explored. That's always something that could be explored as an enhancement to any of the alternatives that we looked at to provide that to provide a connection across Vasquez. We did not have any that we looked at as that was a part of that alternative. It would be something that if there was funding, it would enhance any of them.
Because is that something that could eventually be looked into? And then also could we get more information? Is there more studies or anything if there is bridges that it's safer for the pedestrians to have the bridges instead of, it seems like to me it would be a safer possibility for the pedestrians.
So a lot of times the effectiveness of a pedestrian grade separation has a lot to do with the surrounding area, where you would put it, if people would use it, right? Instead of just crossing at grade. It's really key to put it in a location where people would use it instead of crossing at grade. So as I said, like anything that we could move forward with, then it could be looked at as something, because then you would know like where the different improvements are being made and where you might want to put such a grade separation.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand that our staff has recommended certain improvements to consider and pursue and other ones to ignore and to no longer look at. Does any opinion come out of any of the council members regarding those recommendations after seeing this presentation? Councilwoman Grimes.
Yeah, so I actually had originally put my hand up for the same reason that Jennifer just was talking about. I was curious if there was consideration given to elevating the pedestrian experience at this intersection and what that might do to some of the alternatives that you're looking at. Does it advance an alternative to a higher priority or a better option if you take the pedestrian piece out of the equation, so to speak? I just want to make sure that we're making, I understand we have to do it within our budget and there are some restrictions, but I want to make sure we're making the best choice for it's a crazy intersection. Let's do the best thing that we can now rather than just punt and say we'll fix it later. And so if there are opportunities to do it better now, I'd like to explore that.
Councilmember Dare.
Yeah, so, I mean, it kind of sounds like we're almost using pedestrians as an excuse here, right? Because, it's pretty obvious that the best option would be to have a bridge over Vasquez. And we were saying that, the pedestrians is one reason that we're moving from, this 3-phase crossing to a 2-phase, possibly a 1-phase. So I guess my question is, what's the benefit to Commerce City and the residents by going this route? Because to me, I'm seeing a lot of negatives for our residents and the mobility in the city for people that are living in Commerce City, commuting to other parts of Commerce City. So we already have, train blockages at other intersections, and we're taking away some of these movements for local traffic and access to businesses for the sake of, regional transportation and better flow from outside of Commerce City. So, what's the benefit to Commerce City residents?
So the benefit to Commerce City residents is really what I outlined with the recommendations themselves. As far as the reduced delay and queuing at 60th and Vasquez, also up at 62nd and Vasquez, and that new access to Vasquez up there, and really the circulation using those roadways. The pedestrian changes are really part of many of the alternatives. So, and like I said, any of the alternatives could have a bridge or not have a bridge. So that is an enhancement that can be explored, but I don't think is a decision. It's, if you looked at a bridge with all of them, they would still have the same results, if that makes sense. So because we don't have, they're all at grade intersection type of short, improvements.
I think we talked about a bridge in February when this was first brought to us, and that it seemed to be cost prohibitive and that we were dissuaded from it. So I think we need someone to speak directly to that regarding the cost on a bridge, because otherwise, since we brought it up then and it wasn't included as one of the options, then we should probably know why it wasn't included as one of the options.
And we can definitely look at the cost of what a pedestrian grade separation would cost, just conceptually, and then take that and add that onto all of the alternatives to see what the difference would be with each of the alternatives. That's definitely something that we can do. But what I was trying to say was none of these are something that would require necessarily a pedestrian bridge over others. So to say, oh, well, this alternative would have a pedestrian bridge, so that for that reason, we're going to choose that alternative. A pedestrian grade separation could happen and enhance any of them.
And I think that's where we're leaning towards. We understand that it's a short term, and that's good, but I think we also want to look at the long term. And not only is it a really reckless driving for area, but also pedestrians, and we're really leaving them out and kind of just leaving it there because it might be too expensive. I think it's a good option to really look at how much it is and add it to the alternative. I do like the alternative. I totally understand where Oscar's coming from about Walgreens and those businesses, but I think something has to change for the greater good of driving there. But I think we're leaving out our residents who want to walk over to Starbucks or Arby's, and I think especially that area. As a kid growing up, going to that rec center, we'd always walk to Wendy's, right? And in the summer days, you get a lot of those students or kids that want to go to the dollar menu at Wendy's or now Starbucks. So I think that's something that we really definitely have to consider when we're doing some type of upgrade here. And then let the council decide if it's too expensive or not, or where we could find funding if that is an option. So I like the alternative for the driving part of it, but I would love to see how do we help our residents get over there walking.
If I may, this is Joe Wilson speaking. I'd just like to add a little bit of enhancement on to the different options that we had discussed. These options, as they have been presented, were presented so that pedestrian traffic could travel at surface level. As Stacy had mentioned, any of these enhancements with the structure could be built over any segment of the road. A determination would need to be made of how many structures you would want to build, potentially 4, which could cost typically more than $1 million a piece to do those once they're finished and completed with the appropriate lighting, access for handicap pedestrians as well. So that would add a substantial amount of cost. And those projects could actually be added to any of the options that are currently being considered. And it would not inhibit any of those options moving forward. It would just be a further pedestrian enhancement to the options we're already considering. And if that were the case, you could have a surface pedestrian crossing as well as an overpass, if you will, as a structure. And over time, you could transition that from an at surface level pedestrian crossing to a above grade crossing as funds become available, and you could add on to that project as well.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah.
And I think knowing it now will help us plan for the future. I understand that we could add it in the future, but then, you know, knowing it now, so this council can make that decision and leave it for the other council. If we do decide, they already have some sort of plan and blueprint for them, because often it goes back that we get something from a previous council and the budget skyrockets and they got to buy more properties because, you know, they didn't really look into it. So knowing this now would help us plan for the future. So I would still like to see what it would cost, just to have it in a blueprint already. And if this council decides not to, the next council already has something they were working with, instead of going back, getting another firm to look at what structure, where it could go. We're doing it now. Why not just put it in the plans now? That's how I feel about it.
Sure. No, I understand completely that this could be something that could be incorporated with the current project, or it could be added later as funds become available or the top timing becomes more appropriate, and that we'll already have it positioned if as the possible locations and order of magnitude of the cost. Understood.
Joe, can you tell us what Commerce City's portion of this will be? Is it a percentage? And is there something special that we have to do in terms of funding, or does it come out of our regular budget?
Well, right now, the current funding level for this project and that funds that are currently available is roughly $12 million. It's about, about 5.5 each from DRCOG and CDOT, and $1.5 million from Commerce City. The magnitude of the current being explored is in the $20 to $22 million range. So we already have a $10 million delta that we have to make up. And we're searching for other sources for grant money, whether it be highway safety funds or freight line funding or other, maybe additional federal funding through a build grant, additional DRCOG funds. So right now, in terms of order of magnitude, we have enough, we have about $12 million worth of funds available. And depending on which combination of options we pursue, the current portfolio of options that we're looking at right now are in the neighborhood of roughly $20 to $22 million to execute, depending on how we combine the pieces parts, if you will. So considering that possibility of possibly adding some superstructures for pedestrian traffic, that would add some additional funding that we would have to find alternative sourcing for as well. So that there's some potential additional costs associated with that. So this project in its totality is not fully funded, but we're in active pursuit of additional funds so that once the designs are completed and the right-of-way acquisition is obtained, that we would have the sufficient funds we need to finish the construction of the project.
Thank you.
Because I would just like to add, like I was saying, I just think the surface level is too dangerous for pedestrians. So before we could proceed, I would want that added because I just think it's very a dangerous area.
Yes, and we can clearly we can do that and show those options and what the benefits are as well as the costs. I think one of the things that was highlighted, and I apologize if I'm retracing the same ground. One of the reasons why we would be changing the movements, if you will, and making it kind of only right-hand in movements, is by cutting down the number of movements that eliminates the possible number of conflicts between vehicle and pedestrian traffic as well, and it makes it safer. And then also in this intersection, there would be safety islands, if you will, that would be bigger, and the timing for the pedestrians crossing the street would be better sequenced for that. So that's a combination of efforts that are being made here, is to minimize the number of movements within the intersection, providing islands of refuge, if you will, for pedestrians, as well as enhancing the timing of the signalization so that the pedestrians can cross in a safe manner, so they don't feel anxious or scared, if you will, when crossing the road. But we can still and will add the option of what it would cost, if you will, in terms of dollars, as well as timing to add any sort of pedestrian structures, and what the priority may be, since you theoretically have potentially 4 structures you may have to build, but you may only choose to build 1 or 2 depending on the number of pedestrians that we feel that we have to deal with on a routine basis.
Because one of those bridges that I like too, there's a bridge structure right over Highway 85 in Brighton for pedestrians. And if, that's something, if you guys can, if staff, and can explore that bridge structure, as well for a possible similar, bridge. Thank you.
Sure, we can do that. Yes, ma'am.
And just one more question, Joe, or this might be for Stacy, I'm not sure, but if you take the pedestrians and elevate them, are there options that aren't presented here that might be better at grade? Does it open up the opportunity for additional options for movement if you take the pedestrians out of the equation?
No, if you take the pedestrians out of the equation for every alternative, they will perform comparatively the same to each other. The ones that, and these all considered the pedestrian timing, but if we take that out, because there's a pedestrian grade separation, they would all change the same. Does that make sense? Like all of them?
It does. Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I was just suggesting that, and I don't know, maybe the answer is just a definitive no, but is there alternative movement options for traffic that haven't been explored, that aren't presented as an option now if you take pedestrians out?
Not that we've come up with in our brainstorming or anything like that, because we did take the pedestrian movements into consideration if we could take them out, sort of thing, but we were trying to accommodate them within each alternative as best we can to make the best enhancements at grade.
Okay.
And if I can just think back on what Stacy had said, is part of the balance was considering the local traffic, either vehicle or pedestrian, the through traffic, which would have an impact of actually how physically wide Vasquez is, and the fact that we are concerned and interested in making sure that our businesses get the proper exposure and visibility and ease of access. So those frontage roads add a little bit extra width to the roads and add some further challenges in terms of making sure that all the movements are done in a safe manner and for the vehicle traffic, as well as ensuring that the pedestrians have enough time, enough areas of refuge to safely traffic across the intersection as well. And understanding council's direction that we would look into putting some sort of overpass or superstructure across one or possibly multiple segments of the road so that we could ease the pedestrian traffic and make it safer for pedestrian and vehicle traffic as well.
That would be really great, Joe. And Joe, can you explain how we went from 12 million to 22 million?
Well, the 22 million has always been, and I may not have this exactly right, the 20 to 22 million is kind of was the best guesstimate in terms of order of magnitude for the project. But in terms of actually initial funding for the project, we were able to get funding contributions from CDOT, who has already invested a lot of time and energy into this project on trying to make what has become to known as near-term improvements to the to Vasquez Boulevard in advance of the interchange improvements as part of the I-270 project. So this money, CDOT has set this money aside for these near-term improvements. We went and asked DRCOG for a contribution to help us to complete the design and to start right-of-way acquisition and some preliminary work. That was an additional, of 5.25 million. And then Commerce City contributed 1.5 million as a match to DRCOG's portion. So that was only to get us to the next phase of the project. And typically with DRCOG and funding sources similar to that, you kind of fund it one phase at a time. And because there's so many projects that are competing for funds, that is very rare that a project is fully funded from initial preliminary design to construction in just one bag of money, if you will. So we have to continue to show progress that we're, meeting the needs of our constituents at the local as well as the through traffic, so that we can compete for money at the next phase. And for each step of this building block approach, the farther along we get down the road, if you will, the greater our odds of improving, of getting the additional funds to bring the project to closure.
Thank you for that explanation.
Councilman Madera.
And what improvements will be made to these streets that we're having the spillover for? So like specifically 60th Avenue, there's not a whole lot of siding there to work with to make improvements. And now you're gonna move all the traffic from both north and south of 60th to converge on 60th. And there's some businesses there that have entire fleets of trucks, large trucks like Cooper, that every morning and evening are going to be traveling that. And that's a good number of trucks.
So we are, as we move forward, we'll look at exactly what the lanes are needed on 60th and the improvements that are needed along 60th as we start to make the decisions about which frontage road option and things like that, because it really depends on that as far as exactly how many lanes in the circulation that needs to happen. So that's part of what we're doing when we move into conceptual design with the recommended alternative, is exactly what you're talking about, and looking at those lane configurations needed to make sure that the operations work along not just Vasquez, but along 60th and Parkway and 62nd.
Right. I guess, my question is there any feasible improvements, being that you have now Starbucks, directly adjacent? There's no room to expand without taking out our newest, commercial business, or Wendy's, who just remodeled and, is on the north side of 60th.
So a lot of the improvements that we saw at 60th and Vasquez, we're actually reducing the queues on 60th itself from from the no action if nothing is done. So there might need to be longer lanes or changes in striping, but we did not include major widening necessarily along 60th as part of the need to see the benefits that we saw. So we did not see the need to widen for long distances along 60th. That's not to say at the new intersection to the west that there wouldn't need to be turn lanes or something like that. But we did not see the need for whole-scale widening of 60th to get the improvements that we saw.
So 4 months ago when we had this meeting, I made the comment that we don't have the money to do it right the first time, but we have the money to do it twice. And I see that to be the same exact thing going on here. You've presented the same alternatives to us. You've looked at the impact of it, but I don't think that it really shows the impact this is going to have on Commerce City residents. It's not going to, it doesn't show the impact that it has on the houses living on Forest Drive and the people that are going to be speeding down there trying to avoid parts of this intersection. It's not going to show the impact on the businesses on the west and the increased businesses that we're trying to go build up there. I think Oscar hit the nail on the head. This improves regional transportation and at the cost of Commerce City residents and Commerce City businesses. And it just seems like every single time CDOT comes in and presents this, and this is about the fourth time I've seen this presentation from either you guys or from an engineer from Jacobs talking about this is the wonderful things we can do, nothing changes. It's the same exact alternative that you showed us back in February. It's the same exact impact that it has on Commerce City residents and Commerce City businesses. And why is it that we should expect to have to take the fall in order to improve regional transportation and help the trucks get off of Highway 76 and down to 270 or down to I-70, depending on where they want to go? This doesn't help Commerce City. This hurts Commerce City. And it's going to be a backlog on all those adjacent streets that are going on. And it's going to impact the ability of people to live peacefully in the neighborhood, to get to the businesses they want to. And so I just, once again, want to know, why don't we do it right the first time instead of trying to piecemeal this thing together and do it in a manner that is just going to cause more problems than we fix?
I don't think that's a question for me.
Well, I would say, this is Ryan. I guess I would say, Stacy, how does it impact? I mean, back to the 60th, I think longer signal time will help it dump out. It doesn't directly, I'm not directly answering the mayor's question, just sort of speaking to 60th. 60 will have greater signal time, is that correct? So that traffic can flow off of 60th much more efficiently instead of being stuck in long queues. So that's just sort of one item. We've talked about in the past, Stacy, that the local circulation is actually improved, or we feel it's actually improved. You know, we have to look further, I guess, into the Forest Drive, but we did talk about doing traffic calming measures on that if there is an issue there. I guess from my perspective, it seems as if the local circulation will actually be improved somewhat by the addition of the signal at 62nd, and then also taking away, increasing safety quite a bit for all modes, really, pedestrians and vehicular traffic. We're particularly cognizant of the pedestrian traffic, honestly, and not focusing so much on just mobility through the area. So I don't know if Stacy, you could talk a little bit more about the internal circulation or the circulation sort of around the intersection.
Sure.
But from my perspective, the actual ability of people to get to and from within the area is increased.
Yes, so again, at the 60th and Vasquez intersection, the decrease in delays across the board, that is the overall intersection, that is not just Vasquez, but the improved operations of the intersection and the reduction of queues. We did not just look at Vasquez, we looked at reducing queues on 60th and Parkway as well. And so the recommended alternative provided the best operations for that at 60th and Vasquez. So that's not just through on Vasquez, but also getting it on and off of Vasquez and across Vasquez for those local movements. Looking overall, we considered up at 62nd, and that's why we were looking at adding the signal at 62nd. While that actually puts a little more delay on Vasquez because you're adding a traffic signal, it provides another location for people on the east side in that local area, a location to get full on and off access of Vasquez in all movements. Like right now, you can't get south on Vasquez and those movements. So making sure that that was a full movement signalized intersection to enhance that access on and off of Vasquez at 62nd was definitely part of everything that we looked at. And so with that, and then looking at the west side, not just closing off the frontage roads, but looking at those options on the west side for getting over to Claremont or closer, looking at the balance of, do we want to be closer to Vasquez with that connection, but then you might not be able to get on and off of 60th as well, or because you're closer to that intersection, but also looking at options of getting over to Claremont so that it creates a more local street network so that people can move around easier and get out of the congestion and all the accesses and things that are happening at 60th and Vasquez to move around the other areas and giving those options for people. Like on the east side, if they want to go south on Vasquez, they don't necessarily have to go through the 60th intersection. They can go up to 62nd. So providing more choice for people to access Vasquez, we feel is a benefit to the local area and businesses. While the left out from Parkway is important to the operations of that intersection, not having that phase, we do keep all the movements in, including the lefts in. And so then people will have to go up to 62nd to get back southbound. But, and we need to look at what needs to happen on Parkway and 62nd and Forest Drive for those types of movements and see what needs to happen. But those are the types of things that we need to look at as we move forward. But we are trying to know that this is the alternative that we're moving forward so we can get into those details.
So when I look at your map, sorry, Oscar, when I look at your map for alternative 2 for the improved frontage road system, which is the recommendation, I don't see a way that you can go eastbound on 60th Avenue and turn north onto Vasquez.
You can. I'm not sure why. If that's not clear, then we need to change the graphic. So all of the movements for Parkway, 60th, and Vasquez are there except for the left out from Parkway onto southbound Vasquez. That's not shown in this alternative because that was in alternative 3. That is the piece from the other alternative that we're combining. The arrows on here were showing the frontage road movements and how those were going to change, not the movements from 60th or Vasquez.
Okay, so my question regarding taking away the left out from Parkway, you still show with that arrow the ability to go from Parkway turning left onto 60th Avenue. Will that stay?
So that is part of that alternative. The piece about Parkway is actually on the next graphic. So the movements to and from Parkway that would be allowed is the part of alternative 3.
Councilman Hurst.
Sorry. Yeah, I appreciate this discussion. I just wanted to kind of add some clarifying points from experience. The width of this roadway, any pedestrian structure would also have to be over 18 feet tall due to the requirements in the traffic. So we'd be, in my experience, and this is probably dated, quite dated now, it'd be well over $3 million to add a pedestrian structure here. That's one. Because of the lane width when you add the additional frontage roads. And so the other side of it is why we didn't get a direct answer on why we're not paying for this and doing it right the first time is because the folks answering this question don't have any authority on doing so. They could have asked for $50 million for this, and then the Transportation Commission says you get 5, and we'll fund it piece by piece as you develop it. So they're working within the constraints. So what they're doing is presenting a PEL findings and telling us what the best course of action that they can find out of the study is. And so for the factors that they're playing in, that's what they're trying, that play into this is what they're trying to solve. Now, I can tell you also from experience, if we want to add a structure, more than likely it's going to be coming directly out of Commerce City's budget, because if the PEL doesn't find that as an additional added benefit, it's going to have a long uphill battle on getting additional funding to fund that portion of the project if the PEL doesn't call out those direct impacts. And so from what I hear, you know, we're kind of running in a circle where it's more of an internal discussion of, can we add the funds to add a pedestrian structure to this project? And that might be for us to have an internal structure or internal discussion on, is that a 2K project? Is that something we want to fund? Is that the direction we want to go? I'm 100% game on that discussion, because if you guys remember several months back, my number one concern about all of the alternatives was future development and how we're going to move pedestrian traffic appropriately once we have the Mile High Greyhound Park developed there and we have a higher density of people traveling in that area, more cars parked on the street, less room to travel on the roadways in that densely populated area. And so I think there's a lot of challenges to this. I think there's several additional steps that need to be taken before it goes out to bid and actually gets delivered. But just wanted to add some perspective on cost. I'm sure they could come back with a far more detailed cost breakdown for a pedestrian structure, but I wanted to give a ballpark, just put it out there. We're talking about one structure, but if we're talking about doing on each side of the road, we'd be talking, you know, adding $6 to $10 million from my experience.
Councilwoman Grimes.
I'm not sure that my comments have much to add at this point. I agree with you, Mayor. I would rather see us do this right the first time than do it a second time. But I do agree, Councilmember Hurst, the pedestrian discussion is probably an offline internal discussion, but I think it's one that we should probably consider having. I just want to make sure that we're not being constrained by, if there's a constraint we can remove, then, and make it so there's another alternative that's better, then that's all I was getting at. Like, how do we do it the best way the first time for Commerce City, for our residents? So I don't know where that leaves us right now.
And if I could just chime in real quickly, we did go after, at the time of Proposition 109 and 110 came out, we did try to go after additional funding for more of a ultimate solution, I guess. And when those failed, we had to really sort of circle back and see what, you know, kind of balance out what we thought was a good estimate and realistically what we could get something going on the ground to make improvements based upon a limited funding scenario. So it's the Councilmember Hurst's point, which I think was good, is we're sort of working, at least I feel we're working within what we feel we can optimize kind of what we have, with balancing out the reasonability of additional funding, as Joe had mentioned, so of going after additional funding.
Yeah, Ryan, if I could dovetail on what you were mentioning, is that, you know, this process, as we're bringing it back to council, it's meant to be an iterative process to try and refine it to meet the needs of multiple stakeholders and constituents. For example, several of the alternatives in the initial PEL had suggested basically shutting down Parkway in total. We've all kind of agreed that we can't do that for a multitude of reasons, financial reasons with respect to our tax base, as well as the businesses that we have there. Also, some of the options also presented included blocking access to the frontage roads, which, you know, from a Commerce City perspective is not acceptable for us for a multitude of reasons again. So as we go to the next stage of this process, when we look at these options, that's how we got to adding the one-way in to Parkway predominantly, as well as the one-way into the frontage roads, to try and strike a balance between the needs of constricting or limiting the width of Vasquez for safety measures, as well as making sure that we continue to provide a proper and appropriate access to the businesses and the storefronts in the area. So we're trying to make sure that they're able to do it right for Commerce City residents, as when we say right, is so their ability to access the storefronts so that we can continue to do business, as well as to do it in a safe manner. In addition to the through traffic that has to clearly traffic through Commerce City. We want to make sure that that's done in a safe, orderly way so that that doesn't create any conflict or harm to residents as well. So part of this process why we're here today is to get that additional feedback from you so that we can refine these options and then take them to the next step and determine the viability and the executability, of each of these options, and can continue to get feedback from council as well as the stakeholders, the property owners, the businesses, to see if we can come to a solution that's viable for all the different stakeholders. And so this process is a difficult one. It's challenged by the complexity of the intersection and the limited financial resources that we currently have. But it's a challenge that I think that we're up to, and that we can make this situation significantly better than it currently exists. That will be for the benefit of the Commerce City residents in total. So I apologize for a long-winded answer to that.
One last thing that I meant to add earlier is I did want to mention, one of the genesis of this project is the 270 improvement project. And one of the things I seem to remember us discussing in our last presentation is, these changes are critical to the proposed changes of 270 performing to its maximum ability, essentially. And so if we don't make some sort of improved flow at this Vasquez intersection, it will negatively impact the operation of the 270 improvements, which essentially, be a waste of an investment on 270 if your feeder and arterial roads aren't supporting the new operation of it. And so the solution also plays a bigger picture in overall mobility of our area in terms of 270, trying to eliminate that from being a parking lot. This plays into that. And so there's a bigger picture. That's another reason to push for a positive solution, is because it needs to improve the operation of the interchange onto 270 off of Vasquez.
Councilman Hurst, if I could, I appreciate you bringing that up, because as many of you are aware that we did receive initial funding to start the first phase of the design for the I-270 project. So that initial preliminary environmental assessment and design is just in the initial phases of starting. And in fact, on the 22nd of June, we have a study session scheduled where the executive director from CDOT is going to come and give an initial presentation to council about the goals and objectives of I-270 project. And from there, we can see how these two projects are going to dovetail together and how they do complement each other. And they are required to be mutually beneficial for this project to be a success as a whole.
Any other comments that anybody wishes to make? All right, I guess that will wrap up this. Anything from staff we need to discuss?
No, sir. We appreciate everybody's comments and inputs, and staff will consolidate them and get that information, get that summary back to council, as well as share that with the engineering team in terms of the next steps, in terms of what we should follow through with respect to further research and investigation on design options.
Thank you. Next on the agenda is the oil and gas LDC update. Will Jason Rogers, Director of Community Development, please make your presentation?
All right, thank you, Honorable Mayor and City Council. My name is Dominic, and I am the local government designee for Commerce City. I will be giving a brief introductory presentation on the oil and gas regulations, and then we will get into some additional questions. In addition to myself, Jason Rogers is on the line, as well as Matt Sura, who is our oil and gas special counsel, who will be able to answer any questions, as well as Matt Hayter, who is our deputy city attorney. So with that, I can go ahead and get started here with the presentation. So I'm going to give a brief outline on the presentation and kind of what we're going to be covering tonight. So we're going to start with the process to date. So what work has been done on the oil and gas regulations and how we've gotten to this point. We're going to be doing a review of the significant public comments that we received during the 80-day public comment period. Based on that, staff has conducted a significant amount of work to assess the public comments, feasibility, incorporation, not only with the current draft that was publicly released in March, but the current process on the COGCC rulemakings have been considered and evaluated as part of the staff recommendations. Within that, we also provided to council that the city is proposing has been named a party to the mission change rulemaking that's currently occurring at the COGCC. We're going to bring an initial assessment and list of topics of interest and concern that the city might want to consider and potentially advocate for or against during the rulemakings. Within that, we'll be talking about next steps moving forward and then council feedback. And as I go through this presentation, so we're going to cover the staff changes and go through the majority of these to the extent that we can cover staff's proposed recommendations and then get to the portion where there are questions for council. We can go back through the presentation and look a little bit more closely at any proposed changes that staff has. Next slide, Dylan. So the current timeline that we have to date. So on November 4th, Ordinance 2235, which was the original oil and gas regulations, were continued by City Council with the idea of coming back and evaluating the feedback that was received and bringing back a proposed new set of regulations. So during that process, there was a first round of stakeholder engagement that occurred between January and early February. There was a study session on February 10th with council, as you may remember, where we covered a number of the major items that ended up getting that ordinance continued and what progress had been made to date on that. Since then, there was on March 10th, a revised staff that was released for public comment. So following that study session, there were revisions made to the draft, rather significant, and then released for public comment. And then during the public comment period, which lasted 80 days between March 10th and May 29th, there was an additional second round of stakeholder engagement meetings specifically on the technical language of the document. And then in mid-March as well, the public comment period was extended due to the COVID-19 outbreak. And then on May 7th, there was a town hall meeting conducted with a city staff panel, including myself, Jason Rogers, and Matt Sura, our oil and gas special counsel, to gather feedback on the proposed ordinance. The public comment period closed on the 29th, and we are now currently at the study session. Next slide, please. So this is just a very high-level overview of the stakeholder input and engagement that has occurred and the parties that we have engaged through this process. So it involves a number of environmental regulatory groups, Tri-County Health Department, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and a number of folks at the Denver Environmental Quality Division regarding air quality regulations. We've engaged the industry with COGA, American Petroleum Institute, and a number of oil and gas operators, the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission themselves, North Range Concerted Citizens. We've met with the Oil and Gas Focus Group 2 times since November, a number of developers and home builders through a specific stakeholder group, the League of Oil and Gas Impacted Coloradans, Conservation Colorado, and then the public. Next slide, Dylan. So this is just a brief overview of the regulations and kind of where we're at and how we got to this point. So next slide. So this is something that we've communicated many times throughout the numerous study sessions, but the overall goal and objective of the draft LDC changes on the feedback that was given to staff and how to pursue forward was to codify the existing best practices that came from the regional operator agreement, adopt local government protections granted through Senate Bill 181, incorporate a number of meaningful health, safety, welfare, and environment protections, regulate oil and gas development specifically through the zoning authority that local governments have, establish a new and effective process for permitting, approval, and permit evaluation, and incorporating relevant feedback from interested parties to the greatest extent possible. Next slide, please. So a brief overview of what's being proposed within this draft that was publicly released in March. So it includes a modification of the approval criteria and review process. So that includes a two-tier council approved process or a staff review process, depending on a number of circumstances. There's a limit on the timeline to drill, which is proposed, which isn't currently in our code. The evaluation process of an initial assessment process, looking at the configurations of planned activity and trying to assess siting in a feasible manner. A reduction in the allowed zone districts. So currently in our code, an oil and gas operator could apply for an oil and gas permit in any zone district. This has been scaled back to agricultural and industrial zone districts only. There was also a proposed 1,000-foot setback, and there is no current minimum setback in the code. And then an additional reverse setback between 300 and 500 feet, depending on the size of the facility, which does not currently exist in our code. Next slide, please. There are additional application requirements and a number of plans that an operator would need to provide. These are relatively varying and vast in scope. There were also proposed visual mitigation, fencing, landscaping, lighting, noise standards, and sign standards, which were included. There are increased inspection costs, which the current code that we currently have does not contemplate inspection authority, since that was not a component previously allowed. An additional requirement for continuous air quality monitoring, a number of updated definitions, looking at fines as it pertains to the COGCC or fees of that nature, and then including the best management practices as a separate document from the LDC. As you may remember, previous council direction that was provided was the regional operator agreement that was signed with Extraction, using that as a base template and looking where we could potentially codify some of those requirements. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of public comments and proposed staff changes. If we can go to the next slide here. Just an overview. So we received about 221 submissions via FormSite and a number of other stakeholder comment letters that were provided. Many of these individual comment letters actually contain a number of similar concerns. So if you look at the overall totality of the public comments that were received, there were many constant and emerging themes that emerged between these comments. So what staff attempted to do was to try and group those comments and concerns based on category and liking. So if we had 4 or 5 people come back and have the same specific concern, we took those comments as a group and then responded to them. So that being said, to the greatest extent, staff was able to respond to public comments. That was done so through this draft and included in the study session packet. So as we go through these following slides, and there are a number of attachments that were included as part of the study session packet, highlighted in red is an area where new language is proposed in the draft, and then highlighted in red with strikeouts is areas that staff is proposing to remove based on public comments. Next slide. So this is the first comment that we're addressing in terms of the initial assessment process. So there were concerns that came from the industry questioning the criteria for the limited exemption sites, or sites that would be eligible for an administrative permit review and waiver of the initial assessment process. So there were concerns from the industry about the number of criteria that would need to be contemplated in order, in addition to the 2,000-foot setback. And the question was, are there any viable sites in the city where you could potentially locate an administrative location? And the answer is yes. So there are a number of analyses that were conducted to determine that there is land in the city that meets this criteria. As the city continues to grow and thinking about this regulation in terms of the current state and time, and as we continue to annex further east and north of the airport, the amount of a limited exemption area will increase, and that will happen as we move farther to the east. And consistent with previous council feedback, developing a 2-tiered permitting system where there's a baseline, there's the minimum thresholds and requirements that an operator needs to meet regardless, but then providing some incentive for sites that are located generally farther away from a number of conflicting land uses. So within that, there was an attempt to differentiate 2 different processes based on 2 different standards. Next slide, please. So what's being proposed here is some additional clarifying language that staff noticed through the review and based on some of the public comments. So there are additional considerations and setback requirements in the current draft, which requires 1,000-foot setback from public water supply wells. You may recall the letter that was provided that you all voted to sign, stating additional stringent requirements in the COGCC regulations for public water supply wells. This is just changing a small Scrivener's error to make sure that that 1,000 feet is consistent with 215266, which is the setback requirements. And then there was the additional addition of DIA technology as a contemplated land use, which increases potential viable sites with sites that may not be conflicting from a land use perspective. Next slide. So comments also came from the industry stating the amount of application materials being required during the initial assessment process was extensive, and that providing a minimum of 3 sites is not feasible. So from the experience that the city has in evaluating land uses in context and that type of nature, and to engage in this type of exercise and be able to evaluate where sites may be appropriate, where they might not be appropriate, and how to evaluate potential consolidation of sites, there needs to be enough level of detail and information necessary to evaluate through an application what conflicts might exist. Staff acknowledges that there may be an extraordinary circumstance where a plant operation is planning to go where there can't feasibly be 3 sites located. We're acknowledging that not every scenario is going to be the exact same scenario, and there might be a reasonable scenario where you might not be able to provide a minimum of 3 sites to review. So what we're proposing in our language is if there is a specific or unique circumstance where that may not occur, explain that in writing in your application, and the director would have the authority to waive that requirement if the response is justified. Next slide. Neighborhood meetings. So this was a small change that the industry noted. So going through our other requirements for neighborhood meetings, there's not language saying that significant neighborhood impacts shall be presumed for an oil and gas permit application. So what we're doing here is just striking that language and requiring a minimum of 1 neighborhood meeting. And then through the application process and through the initial assessment process, determining whether or not a site will have significant adjacent impacts and that type of thing. Next slide. Air monitoring. So there were various concerns that were raised from the industry regarding proposed air quality monitoring regulations. There was a lot of work that was put into revising this draft from November and March. And looking back at some of the public comments that were made, there may be some things that were actually addressed that may not have been clear enough through our communications and what actually changed. So what's being here. So there were some concerns on outstanding issues on the specific pollutants to be monitored, continuous monitoring requirements for the life of the well, and turnaround time on canister samples. And to provide a little bit of background on the purpose of these regulations as it relates to air quality monitoring, staff is aware the Air Quality Control Commission is going to be adopting some form of air quality monitoring regulations in September. And this was intended to be a stopgap measure to make sure that in the event that there was a permit that came through before that occurred, that there are some form of air quality monitoring requirements in place. So there's some clarity and flexibility on this provision being proposed, understanding the purpose and the intent of what was intended with these regulations. Next slide. So there are some minor minor tweaks being proposed, which basically says that the plan shall also describe how the operator will conduct continuous monitoring. Monitor air pollutants, monitor that canister sample shall include the specific pollutants measured below. It does not state, and there was some clarification that was needed because it was interpreted that every single particulate or PM 2.5, HAPS, oxygen monoxide, all of that there would need to be continuous monitoring for every single instance of that, which there might not be reasonable technology available to do that. So this is essentially saying, provide us a plan of what kind of monitoring will be expected, what types of impacts do you expect on this potential site, and what is going to be monitored from a continuous basis, but also what's going to be monitored through a canister sample. All of the types of pollutants that are listed in that section are able to be monitored and evaluated through a canister sample, which is deployed on site in some sort of abnormal or public health and safety concern. So there's also some additional language that continuous monitoring may be required until all wells are plugged and abandoned on a site for sites that are within 1,000 feet of residential homes. And then some language on the turnaround time frame for expedited lab analysis for canister samples. Next slide. Cumulative impacts. This was one of the most significant public comments that staff evaluated from the public. And there were a number of comments specifically from Logic and the North Range Concerned Citizens asking the city to address cumulative impacts of well sites within the staff's draft. This includes cumulative air impacts, noise impacts, visual impacts, and a number of the impacts that you see listed. To be direct, staff does acknowledge that there is a need for operators to provide some sort of assessment of how a particular well site would contribute to a regional impact. The problem is in terms from a local government scale to effectively measure and assess and quantify the data it receives. There's entities such as the Regional Air Quality Council and Air Pollution Control Division that are better suited than local governments to take up this. Given that and looking for guidance from the COGCC as how they plan to approach this, we were looking to have a little bit more robust and direct guidance as to how to go about that. So that being said, we acknowledge that there needs to be some consideration, but as to what that level is, we're still waiting to see. But in the intermediary, next slide, we're looking at some proposed definitions. So adding a subsection 114, cumulative impact shall mean the effects of an action that are added to or interact with other effects in a particular place and within a particular time. So it accounts all disturbances, since cumulative impacts result in the compounding of effects and actions over time. This can be viewed as the total effects on a resource, ecosystem, or human community of that action and all other activities impacting that resource. So when we looked at this, we really looked at two areas that we could potentially incorporate cumulative impacts assessment. Then the number one would be air quality impacts, and the number two would be noise. If you do look at some of the other areas that the public requested comments on cumulative impacts, there are some aspects such as visual impacts or traffic impacts and a number of other items that are listed. There already are proposed methods in the proposed draft to incorporate that. So for instance, when the city receives a traffic impact study, it's reviewing traffic impacts that exist outside of the individual pad boundaries, and to some extent, while not a regional impact in terms of the Denver metro area, you could assume and you could look at the potential traffic impacts in conjunction with other sites within the eastern area of Commerce City or those types of things. So there are some captures and some ways to assess some cumulative impacts from the types of plans that we're requesting. Visual impacts, that's another one. So when operators are proposing visual impacts, they're taking about 5 or 6 different looks at what the site could look like from a number of distances. So you're looking at the cumulative impact of those in conjunction with other activities. So with that, there were some additional language added to include an air quality mitigation plan that considers the cumulative impacts of existing air quality in all planned and existing oil and gas operations within 1 mile of the city. So there's additional language being proposed there. And if we can go to the next slide, there's additional proposed additions to the baseline noise mitigation study in terms of adding baseline and expected cumulative noise levels at each well site. Next slide. So setbacks. There were a number of significant public comments that were received on setbacks. And this is a rather wide-ranging topic. So there's a variety of local governments that have proposed minimum setbacks ranging anywhere from 500 feet to 2,000 feet, citing numerous health studies conducted on public health and safety as a basis in their decisions. Staff evaluated some publications, and the list of publications that were reviewed were included as part of the study session packet, as well as the draft that was provided to council in November. So currently, COGCC staff has proposed a minimum setback of 1,500 feet from 10 building units or more, or 1 high occupancy building unit in their last draft. If you look at the proposed draft at the COGCC level, the setback from 9 or fewer building units has been reduced from 500 feet to 200 feet. Since March, we have not seen a revised COGCC draft. This might be something that stays. It might be something that is not. The area that staff is looking at, so in addition to the 1,000 foot setback, adding other potential setbacks would potentially increase public health, safety, and welfare. But looking at where the COGCC is going with their proposed rulemakings, there's the conversation regarding siting authority. So an operator goes through a city permit, but they're also required to go through a state permit. At the end of the day, who has the ultimate authority on where a site goes? So if the state approves a location, but the city denies a location, or the reverse, who has the authority to determine where a location is? So as their current draft stands, the local government would need to adopt generally similar setback requirements as the state to defer siting authority to the local government. So in a hypothetical example, if the city does not have a setback that is equal to 1,500 feet or 10 building units or more, the state could potentially re-review a city administrative or council approval of an oil and gas permit and potentially go and approve that same location, deny it, or approve it in a different location. So this is an area that the city is monitoring closely to try and figure out how does that dynamic work and what sort of protections need to be in place to ensure that local government has the authority to approve that local siting decision if that is the direction that the city wants to proceed forward with. So next slide. So as part of that, there are some proposed changes to the setback requirements, and we can discuss this a little bit further in detail. But there is a proposed change to increase the setback. So there would be a base setback of 1,000 feet from any residential structure or any of the items listed. But there would be an additional setback if you're within 1,500 feet of 10 or more existing residential or platted residential properties, or one building classified as a high occupancy building unit by the COGCC. And then all of the other remaining setback requirements would stay in place. Next slide. And then with that, we also got a significant amount of feedback from the industry operators and home builders that there was no relief mechanism that was provided with the original draft. So if there is a certain circumstance where an operator wants to approve a site at 999 feet, that would not be allowed under the current March 10 draft. And given that there might be a unique set of circumstances for every specific proposed property, there's a proposal within this there's a proposed additional language addition for you all to consider about some sort of relief process in certain circumstances. So if an operator wishes to seek relief from any of the bulk standards defined within 5266 6A or 216282, which is the setback and the reverse setback, that would need to be reviewed by the Planning Commission and approved by City Council. And then a list of specific approval criteria that would need to be met, including the proposed deduction as the minimum needed for the reasonable development of mineral resources at the proposed location. If necessary, if deemed necessary through the review, that there might be additional best management practices that can protect public health, safety, and welfare. When there's a circumstance where those sites are closer, they would need to evaluate that and mitigate additional impacts from that review setback distance, and then putting a limit on how great that setback reduction can be. So there wouldn't be a proposed setback reduction from 1,000 feet to 100 feet. It would be 20% of that minimum value. And then this would apply only specifically to setback requirements. Next slide. And we believe that will incorporate some specific instances or concerns where 999 feet makes sense, where 1,000 is the minimum, and accounting for other variables that might be considered as part of an application. So reverse setbacks, there were a number of comments received from the home builders community over the proposed reverse setback requirement and how that specific measurement is conducted. So there were a lot of questions about what is the reverse setback, how is it measured, how do we conduct that measurement, and how do we plan accordingly. There were some concerns with home builders about its impact of available developable residential land. And it has been evident through a number of those stakeholder meetings that the specific measurement criteria may be unclear. So there are some proposed methods that staff is proposing to account for that. And one thing to note is the city is aware that the proposed setback measurement differs from the current COGCC standards. We do want to note that we'll cover this a little bit later, but the COGCC's definition of working pad surface and how they're proposing to measure setbacks are starting to think more along the lines of from the edge of a production site, as staff has proposed within this draft. So The purpose for this measurement standard, rather than measuring a setback from the permanent production equipment, is understanding that there might be a greater extent of ongoing impacts that are farther out from the site than just the closest tank to a home or to the wellheads, that there's going to be potentially truck traffic on some of these sites. These are variable instances. They may be in and out. There might be additional redrilling and recompletion of wells over time, and the necessary equipment to go on site and remediate some of those things exist beyond the boundaries of permanent production facility. So that staff does believe that these provisions are necessary to protect health, safety, welfare, and the proposed measurement definition is more protective than the state's current definition. Next slide. So this is an example of an exhibit that we'll most likely refine slightly, but include within the code so it's clear, and it'll most likely be just the production site showing how that measurement's conducted. So looking at an oil and gas facility, looking at the screening and landscaping berm, and then taking the edge of the fence line of the permanent facility and then measuring that to the edge of any property line, rather than the way that the COGCC measurement is currently in place on the left. Next slide. So in order to provide additional clarity, we're adding one additional clarification in 6280, which is that measurements shall be taken from the edge of the production site in the same manner as defined in 215266, since there was some comments that there was disconnect between those two code provisions. Next slide. There were a number of comments received from the industry interpreting that the current drafting of our regulations implied that operators would need to retroactively comply with the new adopted regulations or BMPs after permanent approval or the time of a transfer. As far as that goes, new regulations cannot be applied retroactively at a city level to a permit application that has been submitted or approved. As it pertains to the city permitting process and the state process, if the state approves a permit with more stringent rules and regulations, those would apply at the state level. But if there's additional rules and regulations that are applied on a city level, we can have our deputy city attorney and some of our legal staff weigh in additionally if needed. But we don't have the standing to be able to require additional requirements on top of what was permitted. So within that, there are some additional clarifying language proposed for 2132.16.12a. Next slide. Gathering lines. This was an area that staff identified prior to the February 10th study session. There were some notes from the industry that gathering lines, the COGCC doesn't have authority to regulate those, and we're proposing to strike regulation of removal requirements for those. There was additional area in the BMPs that needed to be modified to reflect that, but it does not specifically regulate gathering lines in terms of denoting them physically in the planning process. So this is an important criteria. So when we have new builders that are developing in areas that were previously oil and gas sites, having these gathering lines recorded at the county and knowing where they are is crucial and instrumental to understanding if there needs to be remediation work done to remove them or to design the subdivision in conjunction with where those permanent facilities are in place and having some form of setback, which our current draft does. Next slide. Flow line reporting standards. There were some comments noting that some of the flow line information the city would be requesting for operators is limited by the recent flow line rulemaking that was conducted at the state. That there's a limitation on the resolution that those can be viewed in order to protect public safety and welfare. There were some concerns raised regarding the requirement to record abandoned flow lines with Adams County. And similar to the gathering lines example that I provided previously, there is that need to account for them during the subdivision planning process to ensure public safety and making sure that new residential lots aren't built over a flow line that was not reported or recorded with the county and that type of thing. So this is, in staff's view, a significant public health and safety protection, and making sure that this data is accessible at the Adams County Clerk and Recorder for prospective developers and landowners that are looking to develop these sites is crucial. And then to account for the public release of this type of information, there's a minor proposed change in the BMPs to reflect the resolution that the COGCC currently publishes this documentation online. Next slide. Plugging and abandoning of wells. There were comments from the industry arguing that the city doesn't have the jurisdiction to regulate downhole issues. And within that, staff is proposing to, and in terms of Senate Bill 181, local governments not having the authority to specifically regulate downhole aspects of wells unless they have some sort of surface impact. So based on that assessment, may request the operator to plug and abandon any specific oil and gas wells that are within the spacing unit that's being applied for, where necessary public health and safety provisions may occur. Next slide. There were some questions in terms from the industry and other stakeholder groups of adding some of the language that the COGCC is contemplating in terms of oil and gas location and working pad surface. We're not proposing to strike the current definitions of well site or production site in lieu of that, but also noting to that those definitions to make things a little bit clearer. Next slide, please. So that was a relatively in-depth overview of staff's proposed changes. And as we discussed, the city is planning to engage as a party to the mission change rulemaking. So within conjunction of that and evaluating things that may need to be changed within the code and where we currently stand with our draft regulations, here's some areas that have been assessed as potential areas during the rulemaking that staff and the city and council would want to engage the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission a little bit more closely. Next slide, please. So the first one is the alternative site analysis. And a lot of the background on this comes from the specific siting and evaluation that occurred in terms of the regional operator agreement and looking at how do you evaluate oil and gas development comprehensively. So as currently drafted, the COGCC is requiring this if it's within 2,000 feet of 50 or more building units. We believe that this should be required if it's within 2,000 feet of any site, regardless of how many building units are there. And 50 is a relatively high threshold to meet in order to look at that. So another thing that was evaluated looking at the COGCC's current draft rules and looking at the type of staff that's on place and with the COGCC, a lot of them are not going to have a background in local government or jurisdictional planning efforts in terms of evaluating what is a comprehensive plan and how do you plan for future land uses and future growth and development of the community. That's a lot of what the community development department does. And the same is true for most local governments in the Denver metro area. And thinking about that, there's a lot of additional work and specific language changes that can be incorporated into the draft to ensure that, number one, this assessment is conducted with a local government in conjunction with the COGCC. So in the instance of saying that the operator conducted an alternative site analysis with the state, but did not consult with the local government before doing so, and then coming to the local government later with that analysis, making sure that that work and initial assessment is conducted together at the beginning to make sure that operators aren't having to go through 2 or 3 separate alternative analyses that may conflict. So there should be additional stringent application materials that are included to evaluate those aspects. And there's additional supportive consultation with local governments, and there should be some additional topics that are discussed under the formal consultation process to make sure that all aspects and all viewpoints and all stakeholders are being considered as part of that. The state should, there's an advocation here for the state to consider automatic adoption of local government siting analysis. And if it meets a minimum set of criteria, which the state would also essentially adopt. So making sure that there's a minimum level of data analysis that's occurring, that this issue is being reviewed from all angles, and then making sure that because of that, if you have another local government that might have a different analysis, that they don't have to go through this process twice. The setbacks, I covered that a little bit in our proposed staff setback language, but the 1,500 feet only applies to 10 building units or more, or 1 high occupancy building unit. And then a minimum setback for 9 or less building units is 200 feet as currently proposed. So you go from 9 building units to 10 building units, and then the setback drops to 200 feet. So within that, and now looking and analyzing where other local governments have been and these types of conflicts, bumping that 9 or less setback to at least 1,000 feet and then potentially increasing the setback based on proximity of residences or high occupancy building units or places of that people significantly gather. Next slide, please. Local siting deference. So getting back into that a little bit, as drafted, the COGCC could review local government's denial of an oil and gas permit and potentially approve it at the state level if it doesn't meet that criteria. And that may cause conflict with the overall goal and intent of providing local governments more siting control. So if there is some difference in the siting and the setback requirements, there may be some scenarios where that counteracts. And as currently drafted, the COGCC could come in and even potentially permit a site that's within a smaller setback versus a larger one. Public water supply wells, I won't get into this too much since you're familiar with this concept in the letter that was provided. And then cumulative impacts, the state is providing not enough guidance for local governments and enough guidance to stakeholders in general on what that analysis is going to be and what they're going to look like. Again, there needs to be some additional work that's done at the state level from the Air Quality Control Commission and the Air Pollution Control Division on what that is, how that's measured, and provide that guidance so there can be some coordination from the city side on requiring such analysis. And then within that, local government may not be the best agency to analyze those impacts. Next slide. Best management practices. The city would like to commend the COGCC for adopting a minimum additional amount of best management practices that weren't in place before and typically only came into the conversation during a private agreement, like a regional operator agreement or any of that type of thing. So the state is taking a more stringent stance by incorporating additional best management practices. That is in line with a number of operator agreements that have been approved within the last couple of years. Standing of proximate local governments. This is another area that will have a significant benefit on Commerce City and other local governments to be able to provide additional opportunities for local governments to consult with potential well sites that may just be outside of the jurisdictional boundaries, but may have impacts on residences or citizens that are within proximity to that. So it'll allow local governments to respond to planned facilities that may have an impact on components in their city but are not currently within their city boundaries. And again, with plugging and abandonment, this isn't an area where the city really will have the jurisdictional authority to regulate. So the COGCC has recognized that there are circumstances where if you're doing horizontal drilling and there is a number of legacy wells that exist, they're no longer viable or suitable and may sometimes might not be safe to actually keep in the ground. So requiring having the director granted the authority to require plugging and abandoning of those wells in certain circumstances is a significant improvement. Next slide. Within that, we wanted to give a highlight of the overall remaining rulemaking process and how that plays into the state's or the city's party status. So on June 26th, COGCC will be releasing a newly revised draft. And then on July 13th, which will be 7 days after potentially adopting these regulations, the pre-hearing statements would be due from parties to the rulemaking. So that would be the city's deadline to provide some sort of response to this Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission about what issues are of importance. For general public comments, the deadline would be August 14th. And then those rulemakings are currently proposed between August 24th and September 10th. Next slide, please. Just wanted to cover some brief next steps. Next slide. So following the study session, assuming there are no major significant changes or anything that would modify the schedule, staff would revise the draft ordinance as proposed in accordance with any additional feedback that you may have to incorporate in this draft before reviewing it. We would re-release that draft as part of us both on the city website, c3gov.com/oil and gas, having some public outreach in terms of social media and alerting folks that there is a newly revised draft. And that would be included additionally within the packet for the Planning Commission hearing, which would happen on June 23rd. Any additional public comments on staff's newly revised draft? So the public comment period ended on May 29th, but that doesn't mean that the city is no longer considering public comments. We're not able to consider public comments after May 29th in terms of discussing during the study session, but they can be added. And if there are any additional comments that members of the public have or any stakeholders might have, they can provide that testimony and additional comment during the Planning Commission and City Council public hearings. Next slide, please. So as it currently stands, we would have that Planning Commission meeting on June 23rd. And on July 6th would be the earliest date the council would hear the first reading of Ordinance 2266. And then the earliest potential date for adoption of the ordinance would be July 20th. And then the next slide. So we have a couple questions if we get to the next slide here. Just kind of a talking point and to help facilitate the conversation. If there's additional considerations or things that need to be mentioned, feel free. But the first one is, are there any issues with the updated language as proposed? Are there any additional topics that we're to consider prior to first reading by City Council? There were a number of other public comments included, and if there might be something that specific members of the community might want to be considering and looking at, if there's any other things that we should be looking at, let us know and we'll take a look. Are there any other items or proposed lines of the public comment that we didn't discuss? And are there any proposed modifications to the timeline? So with that being said, I, Jason Rogers, Matt Sura, and Matt Hader are available to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you for a very detailed overview of all that. Anybody have questions for staff? Councilwoman Noble. You're on mute.
There we go. I unmute myself, actually. Thank you very much. That was really a comprehensive report, and you've obviously put a tremendous amount of time in getting this quick turnaround by having all of these comments and your staff comments available to us when the deadline for having written comments in wasn't that long ago. So thank you very much for that. I don't quite know what to do because I actually have comments pretty much throughout. So should I just kind of go for it here? All right, I will. Thank you. On the overview of draft LDC changes slide, you mentioned that the BMPs must be negotiated and as part of the extraction agreement or regional operator agreement. I'm not sure why extraction agreements are required when we're going to have LDC. And secondly, is there any language that says that whatever is negotiated will not be less than the LDC or the COGCC?
So, Councilmember Noble, to provide a little bit of clarification, that may need to be clarified. So the best management practices, once the code's eventually adopted, those would not need to be negotiated. So this was referencing to previous practice and what other local governments have been doing. But by voting to approve or deny the oil and gas regulations in July, you're essentially approving the minimum set of best management practices that would be acceptable to the city to approve an oil and gas permit. So if the operator wants to go above and beyond and they want to do all the bells and whistles above what the city is requiring as a minimum, they could certainly do that. But there, in the review of a permit, there would be no additional need to negotiate from that point on.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I'm looking at the initial assessment process. It would be the first page, basically, of the initial assessment process, but you have limited exemption sites. And I think the thing that concerns me most of all is that administrative review is liberally through these regulations, and certainly the limited exemption sites is administrative review. And I would like more than anything for the council to be accountable for oil and gas activity in Commerce City. We already saw what happened when the regional operator agreement with Extraction Oil and Gas was put through last year, and it was signed by a deputy city manager in September. So it all happens fairly quietly and out of sight of the residents. And I really do think it's important for any administrative reviews to be removed so that these come before the city council. We need to be having public hearings. Planning Commission has hearings, then it comes to us for a public hearing without administrative reviews. Even if the staff is making a recommendation to us and saying, we believe this should be an exemption, then that's another story. But for staff to be making the decision independently of the city council, I think is something that I would oppose. And I hope that we can all consider that something that we take responsibility for, that if we're looking at, what could be between 8 and 10 sites, more than 200 wells ultimately across 20 square miles of the North Range, covering some 20, 25, maybe more subdivisions in terms of horizontal hydrofracturing under those homes, then I think that's really something we all need to be responsible for. We're the ones who are elected to represent our citizens, and we should carry that. When it comes to neighborhood meetings, it would certainly be important that we do as many neighborhood meetings as possible, and for there not to be any exemptions for neighborhood meetings, that all application comes with a neighborhood meeting. Regarding air monitoring, you did have a really strong tool in here, and that would protect the residents, and then it got changed. And I would encourage us to go back to the language that was there, which is that a monitoring shall be required until all wells are plugged and abandoned, as opposed to may. On cumulative impacts, thank you very much for including this. This has always been extremely important to me, and I have my own personal definition of cumulative impacts. Proximity, and it's siting near homes. Intensity, that's the number of wells, and then concentration, that's the number of sites. And so the more that is of any of these is the cumulative impact. And that would include everything from air to sound to noise and you name it. We know that our friends in Brewfield have been suffering greatly, so these are important to consider. But the definition, to include in the definition, reasonable, foreseeable future, and easily anticipated activity, as opposed to over time. Do you have the words over time in your definition of cumulative impacts?
I'm sorry, Ms. Noble, what was that last statement?
Yeah. So the staff's proposed definition addition.
Okay.
You say cumulative impact takes into account all disturbances, since cumulative impacts result in the compounding of the effects of all actions over time. And I'm suggesting defining over time as reasonable, foreseeable future and easily anticipated activity.
Okay. And Councilmember Noble, I know you're covering a number of different aspects of the codes and the regulations here, and maybe it's appropriate to continue with everything that you have in terms of questions for staff and that type of thing. And I don't know if it's necessary later on in the presentation in terms of what's been drafted. What we have now is a result of prior council and some members of current council's direction. So if there's a collective consensus and feedback on what specific areas of the code to change, I think that's the best and probably most helpful tool for us as a staff to know how to tackle that. And if any members of the oil and gas team, Matt Hayter, Matt Sura, Jason, if you have any additional thoughts on how to best take the feedback as we collect them from council, we can consider that.
I'm happy to take any objections from any of my colleagues. If anyone wants to object to anything I've said, please jump in.
I think if we're going to have any specific language changes, we should get those together and then, have those out to the council beforehand so we have a chance to review it. We can't really speak to these changes without seeing it in front of us. It's a lot to take in having, legal changes without having, Robert and Matt's opinion on those, at least for me personally. So I would suggest maybe sending those proposals out to staff and then having them disseminate it to the rest of the council. So we're not kind of trying to decide blindly.
That makes sense, Councilmember Madera. Then in that case, it would seem then that we would need extra time, because how else are we going to then discuss them if we don't have another session? I mean, this is the way the staff set it up. So unfortunately.
Right. But I mean, we've been working on this for well over a year now. So.
And I have been commenting on it well over a year also.
Right. And this is the result of all those comments, right? So it's not just one person giving staff direction as to, frankly, legal changes in verbiage and the contracts. So, I think passing those specific changes along and then having those disseminated to council is probably the most fair thing for the rest of us in order to make an informed decision and not just try to blindly decide here on right now is more high level type direction as to where we're at with this current LDC and if there's anything that we want to steer in another direction, that would probably be the most helpful for staff rather than, giving them a bullet list of 100 word changes.
I'm not going to be doing a list of 100 word changes. These are also concepts. And I do have the floor. As I said, I appreciate your comments, Councilmember Madera. Yes, and I said I appreciate it. I appreciate your input.
I'm giving you that.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay.
And I would like to continue with my remarks. Thank you. Because in some cases, I believe there is a misinterpretation of things that are available to us. And without us all being on the same page regarding those, then this doesn't make any sense. We need to be able to have an understanding regarding, for example, when they talk about setbacks, it says that the COGCC is proposing that a municipality would need to meet their minimum setback standard, but it's really it's a misreading. They defer to the local government if it exceeds minimum standards. We're able to use the COGCC as a floor. We're able to do more than that.
Yes, we know that.
Okay, so but there is, if you read the materials, there are references throughout the materials to the COGCC and their standards. Their standards don't necessarily matter at this point because we're setting standards, which we're allowed to do now, which are higher than the floor. And we have to decide if that's what we want, is to have stronger regulations that are more protective of the health, safety, and welfare of our residents. I say, yes, we do want it to be more protective because we're looking at an incredible intensity in North Commerce City. We're already paying attention and looking critically at what's happening at the Suncor refinery. If we had known then what we know now, would we have approved the Suncor refinery? The same thing applies to how we look at the regulations for Commerce City in the North End on the new draft oil and gas regulations. What is our minimum need to be? When you first began looking at this, fellow council members who were here before, you were looking at it pre-181. Now post-181, we have opportunities that didn't exist before.
We looked at this pre and post.
You punted on the regulations on November 4th and didn't deal with them. So no, you didn't take care of it then, which then opened it up to the new city council that came. I think it's critical for us to be looking at this. This is what I happen to represent a ward that is far more impacted than any of your wards by oil and gas activity that's proposed for this area. Second is Councilmember Frank's ward. But it's really something we really need to take a close look at. I can see that the staff has done a really good job in terms of trying to make it more restrictive, but there's liberal use of administrative review. I want us to be the ones who are accountable. If this is approved, then we need to vote for it and vote on every single site and every permit. I think it's concerning that there's transferability prior to any of these being, if the construction hasn't started and someone sells their permit, should that be allowable? If we're going to change the rules as we go along coming in the future, or should they have to reapply again if that site is sold to someone else? What about the setbacks? I don't think 1,000 feet is adequate. And I was going to ask the staff why and on what basis they picked that. Why are there modifications, as they call it, and variances if we're not doing meetings again or getting the approval of everyone who lives around the site in order for a modification or a variance? And again, that's administrative review. We're listening to the industry. How many times was it said during this slide presentation, we got feedback from the industry said, etc. In terms of plug and abandon, for example, they said that that's downhole. Well, actually, when you plug and abandon, you also do that on the surface. There is no reason why we can't have a say in that. I just think it's critical to not rush through, because the next time we see this is when it comes back to us after the planning commission. So how are we supposed to rush through this?
I would also agree on, I think Councilwoman Noble has the right to submit what she thinks is best for the city. And if that prolongs the process another week or another study session, I think we owe it to our residents, because that's who represents. And over we hear, what are we doing for the residents? What are we doing for the residents, right? We heard that tonight. And it is. And I think another week or study session with her submitting that to us to see and then move forward. We're always put in a spot to make decisions right here and right now. And I think that's always unfair to us. And the staff did an amazing job. Dominic, I commend you for doing this, man, for going through the whole presentation, tons of hours behind. I thank you very much with the staff. But I think I would like to hear more of what Ms. Noble, if anybody else has some recommendations, and then come back and then give you guys directions, because just off my list is the neighborhood meetings. That's something that I would like to see changed. the residents should have more of a say or even notification. Also, the administrative piece. I think this issue is such on a high level that council should make that decision with this. We often get beat up in the public for stuff staff does, and they're getting paid to do, right? But this is another high level decision that should always come to council. And not saying that the administrator or the director is not doing a good job, but this is another one of those topics that they're not calling Mr. Rogers, they're not calling Dominic, they're calling us. And there's only a few of those that we should always just be in the light of. So I would propose that, you know, Ms. Noble and whoever else sends it to staff, their changes, and send it back to us, because I'm not prepared, to be honest with you, because I would like to hear her insights. I'd like to hear everybody else's insights on how we direct staff, because I'm not prepared to direct staff today and say, yeah, bring it to us for July 6th. But we haven't heard out all of my concerns, all of Ms. Grimes' concerns, Mr. Hurst, all of us. I mean, and I think it's only fair, and we only, and then the next conversation, you know, maybe we don't like some of the concerns I have, and that's fine, right? Staff or council could direct, say, nope, that one is out of our league. Let's go to the next one. And I would feel a lot more comfortable directing staff to send it to Planning Commission and then bring it back if it puts us 2 weeks behind. I think you're right, Oscar. We've been working on this, and the staff of everybody, right, has the staff has done an amazing job, and we're getting there. I think we're getting there. I think we've done a lot of progress, and I think we just need to hear it out. That's what I would do. I'm not prepared to say, yeah, bring it back on the first hearing without hearing all of Ms. Noble's, all of mine, all of your guys's.
So I think there's a couple different issues at stake here, and let's just try to break them down. One, I think everybody has some kind of change that they'd like to see in these LDC amendments. Whether you want them looser, you want them tighter, whatever, you have your own desire. I agree with everybody that has stated that to sit here and hash over every one of these requested changes without having them in front of you, able to read and able to contemplate is probably not the best way forward. You know, once again, we are on a timeline that we have established and that we have allowed the staff to establish to say, hey, this is when we can get this done. Are you guys good with it? We said, yes, that's good. There's probably a lot of changes in there that can be made on the LDC amendments to make it better for everybody. So my recommendation would be that you do your homework this week and get those recommendations into the staff by Friday afternoon. Let them work on them the following week. In our next study session, we can go one by one over those recommendations, and we can say, yes, we want those included, or no, we don't want those included, and just do it as a process through that during a study session. Once that is completed and we have a finalized thing of what we want those LDC amendments to look like, then they can proceed by sending it out to the Planning Commission for review, approval, and vote. And then after their vote, back to us to vote on as a package as a whole. I don't want to be in a situation where we're sitting in a council meeting and we're debating line by line whether or not we want this in. By the time it comes to us from the Planning Commission, it should be a done deal and it should be ready to go. And you either vote for it because you agree with package, or you don't vote for it because you don't agree with package. And that's entirely your choice and what you feel you need to do. But I think that the best way to go forward is everybody does their homework this week. Say what you like, what you don't like. If you put comments in, you put them in. If you don't put them in, then you don't put them in. And then we go over those comments one by one, determine which ones we want to accept and which ones we don't want to. Mr. Rogers, I know you've been trying to speak. Please go ahead and chime in at this point.
Thank you, Honorable Mayor and City Council. I will say that I know me and staff appreciate any and all comments that you all have. And obviously we want to have those conversations with you. I will say, depending upon the dearth and the complexity of the comments and or requests, obviously we will do and make in all of our best efforts to be able to bring our responses, our comments, and our revisions before you. We will try to also stay in front of you if we need additional time, because as what I am hearing is that if we want to do this right, I want to make sure that our staff, my staff, has the ability to be able to dive in and be able to look at the issues and be able to present those to you so that you can make that informed decision. That being said, we will make every effort, every best interest an effort to make it to the next study session. But I would request that if we need additional time to make sure that you all have what you have asked for and that we've been able to respond to, that if we need additional time, that may be granted to us. And once, like I said, we will stay in front of you with this and our responses and how we're making progress on that over the next week and so.
So does anybody have any issue with doing homework this week, putting in your comments, sending them into staff by close of business Friday so that they can have next week to put it together and go over that? Anybody have any issues? Great. I know not everybody had an opportunity to speak. If you have quick comments and you just want to chime in real quick over anything without going into specifics on items that you would like to see changed, since we have a procedure on that, please feel free to chime in now. I know Councilwoman Grimes, you had some comments you wanted to make. Were they specific to the LDC amendments or are they general in nature? You're on mute. You're on mute.
Thank you. I hit the wrong button. I had a list similar to Ms. Noble. And so I like the idea to do the homework and I'm good with that. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Councilman Madera.
Yeah, you know, I just want to remind people that this hasn't been rushed at all. If anything, it's been very deliberate. We've had numerous community outreach and have reached out to all sides of the issue. We've also had study sessions going back to when I just got on council 2 years ago, almost, you know, so, you know, these things have been the cumulative impact, right, of those conversations, people's input, you know, setbacks, for example. They did research and came back with several different options on what's been done. You know, this is all relatively new. As you said, you know, pre and post 181, right? That changed how we were looking at this completely. So, you know, a lot of these things have been hashed out, and it doesn't mean that they're final, but, you know, we've gotten to a point where we've got to make a decision. You know, it's not going to be absolutely perfect, but, you know, those things can be worked out. And, you know, the fact that we're making no decision and inaction, to me, is worse than coming together. And yes, the administrative review did come out of that because we figured that the land development code should be the guiding principle, that it should be the same for every applicant. And these are our standards that are above and beyond the state. And so we're enabling staff rather than having everything come back before council. And then at the end of the day, then we just become a oil and gas commission for Commerce City because, you know, that's going to take up so much time. It's already taken up all this time. So, you know, I implore everyone, do your homework, send in your comments, but know that this is not something that we're rushing through. This is the cumulative impact of 2 years of hard work from staff, our legal department, you know, community development. It's reached so many aspects of the city, and I don't even want to know how many hours have been spent on this because I can tell you it's easily in the thousands, if not, you know, tens of thousands. So, you know, we do need to have more discussion, but let's bring it back the right way and let's stop punting this because we're just going to make the same mistake as the last council, and we're not going to get anything done. You know, it comes a point where we got to hold ourselves accountable and have deadlines for ourselves. And I think this is one of those moments where, you know, Friday's the first deadline, and then going from there, we got the study session to work things out, and then we gotta get this moving because we have so many other things that we need to work on in this city. This isn't the only issue. So let's do our homework and then let's move on. Let's come to a decision and start working on some other things for the city.
Thank you. Councilwoman Ellen Thomas.
Yes, thank you. I just don't understand too. I realize staff has been working on it an extensive time, but I don't see what the rush is. And I live less than 4 miles from Suncor. And I think it's really important before we just jump and make decision, whether it takes us another year or 2 years, we need to think about the safety of the residents and the environment in that area. So, you know, I don't want the same thing that happened over here to the residents in Suncor in the south to occur over there, because this is residents' lives and the environment. So whether previous council was supporting it or whatever, I think, you know, it's very important that we, you know, whether it takes another year, if that's required, we need to make sure the residents and the environment is protected, because I don't want the same thing to occur here. I see the long-term effects of it with the residents and the environment. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, we keep conflating an issue with Suncor and comments being made about, you know, we should have done better before Suncor was done. Suncor was built long before Commerce City was ever Commerce City. So that to continue to try to say, oh, we didn't do a good enough job whenever it comes to Suncor, that structure, that whole facility was built before Commerce City ever existed. So I just want people to keep that in mind, okay? Mr. Rogers?
Thank you, Mayor. I thought it was prudent also, sure, given obviously the feedback that we're receiving from the Mayor and City Council today. What we will also do is obviously we had noted that June 23rd was going to be the anticipated Planning Commission hearing date. Given that obviously there are comments to be received, discussions to be had, decisions to be made, that we will push off that Planning Commission hearing. And until we have a better sense from, I'll say, the City Council, we'll then come back to you with an appropriate schedule. That is obviously after we've been able to address the majority or the outstanding comments or concerns or questions that you may have on our draft. So
that sounds good. Thank you. Is there any other discussion on this item before we move on to the last item of presentation? Seeing no other requests for discussion, we will move on to the request for community assistance funding for round 3 of businesses, city mortgage and rental assistance fund program update. Mr. Rogers, please carry on.
Thank you, Mayor. Once again, good evening, City Council. Dylan, if you do not mind queuing up the presentation, that would be greatly appreciated. And we can start with the first slide. The item tonight is an update for you on staff's progress in standing up a city mortgage and rental assistance fund program. Just a brief recap. At the May 28th City Council, it was the direction received to utilize $500,000 from the CARES Act funding that was received from the county to be earmarked to establish a city mortgage and rental assistance fund program. At the June 1 council meeting, it was further motioned and supported from the May 28th action, and additional guidance was provided requesting for staff to investigate eligibility parameters and being able to service Commerce City residents. Next slide, Dylan. To help with establishing a basic structure on eligibility parameters, staff used the CDBG CARES Act stimulus funding as the spine backbone to see where parameters can branch from to identify a population basis that would be served, process, and or to avoid administration issues that are related. As noted in a number of different conversations about during the COVID update, but ultimately as well during the meeting on June 1st, the city has received $246,587 of COVID stimulus funding from HUD, Housing and Urban Development, of which $200,000 will be a direct disbursement or drawdown for Commerce City residents. We are currently negotiating a partnership with Maker Housing Partners, which during this crisis has partnered with a number of different municipalities in Adams County to administer the prevention of eviction and foreclosure for residents. What you find there in the second bullet point is the basic eligibility parameter, as it is that they serve up to 80% AMI, either from a foreclosure or from a mortgage or rental assistance perspective. What you have at the bottom of the slide kind of just shows you a breakdown on the AMI per number of individuals or individuals that are within a residence, and what is that attributable amount in which they would qualify in order to be able to have the prevention of eviction or foreclosure. Next slide. So using the CDBG COVID or CD funding as a basic foundation framework, to that, staff was then able to identify the following considerations. Duplication of services. An easy way of being able to understand is that under federal guidelines, a duplication occurs when a beneficiary receives assistance from multiple sources that exceeds the total need for a particular recovery purpose. An example of what this might be, and I'm going to pick on Mr. Deputy City Manager Troy Smith, is that if Mr. Troy Smith is receiving a rent check from Maker Housing, then comes to the city to receive a similar rent check, there is a duplication of services or benefits. The impact to the city is that if that is determined to be the case, the city would have to return in its full amount the appropriation that was received from the Housing and Urban Development. So that would be the $246,000 back to HUD. So not a minimal impact. Now, if the intent, once again, is to currently disperse or for disbursement of those funds, there has to be a distinctly different parameters in order to ensure no duplication. So once again, we have the basic parameter in which CDBG is establishing the negotiation, the partnership with Maker, in which up to 80% AMI is going to be the service population basis. The city would have to establish parameters that are above and beyond that. So for instance, think 80% AMI up to 120% AMI, or working with Maker to limit its application of those funds to say just for rent or just for mortgage, and then the city would then backfill the other parameter or basic program that would be established. Once again, now there's also the ability for us to allow for what is a sequential staggered delivery or disbursement of funds. And an example of this would be allowing for Maker or use of the CDBG fund dollars based on those eligibility parameters to be the first out the door. And then as those funds are extinguished, then the city fund would come in and backfill to continue along those eligibility parameters to continue servicing Commerce City residents. Another consideration that comes for City Council discussion is timing of disbursement. Do we disperse concurrently versus sequentially? Does the city funds go out the door first, or does the CDBG dollars go out the first? Obviously, keeping in mind duplication of services and benefits kind of rings throughout all of these various considerations, particularly even with the timing of disbursement. But at the same time, it's also looking at the timeline of when the expenditures have to occur within the use of these funds. City funds, it's been shared that the expenditures for those funds must occur by December 2020, while the CDBG funding that's been received from HUD has a expenditure or drawdown of those funds due date by 2022. So we obviously have a longer life cycle for the HUD funds, while we have a shorter lifespan for the funds that we've received from Adams County. And then one of the other consideration is administration, internal versus external. Looking at that current staffing resources, obviously internally would be a practical administrator. However, there's limited capacity to take on new work. In essence, taking on the actual program would require more staff. This would mean time to train and putting a process in place. This would ultimately delay the funds getting to the residents, which it is our understanding the goal from what we heard and was motioned by council was to get this program stood up by the end of the month. So taking that into account, I would say that one of our goals is to work with a partner, looking to partner with an agency that already has a program in place that can get the funds out to residents quickly. We have performed some due diligence as we receive feedback that once an application is received, that it could take between 2 weeks to a month, depending on the selected vendor, to getting a check out the door to a resident. So a much more rapid deployment of those funds to our residents that we'd be able to we'd be able to take leverage of that opportunity if we had a partnership with a third-party vendor. Next slide, Dylan. And then lastly, one of the other last considerations is target adjusted medium income levels, or AMI. Once again, we're thinking about concurrent disbursement. We have to look at a targeted AMI that falls above or goes above the 80%. So that's 80% to 120. It could be 80 to 100%. It could just be 80%, but we would not be able to service a population basis of 80% and below. Once again, if we want to go with the sequential disbursement, we could mirror what is the COVID CV or CDBG fund parameters working with Maker of having that 80% AMI and being able to serve as a backfill or as an initiator, depending on sequential or concurrent nature. Last slide, Dylan, please. So staff recommendation based off of our analysis of obviously federal guidelines, but also understanding the application and administration of the various funds would be to move forward with a sequential staggered disbursement to avoid duplication of services or benefits. Disbursement of the city funds initially to give expenditure due date, given this expenditure due date of December 2020. Partnering with a third-party vendor to maximize rapid deployment and administration, and target an AMI at 80% or below for both the mortgage and rental assistance, allowing us to be able to have a broader reach and a consistent reach of the application with what's already currently established with a number of other third-party vendors currently operating today. With that, staff is here to answer any questions that you may have.
Mr. Sheasley.
Thank you. I just want to add to Mr. Rogers' presentation about the use of an outside party is also beneficial when dealing with CARES Act funds. And Jason, forgive me if that's not the point of this conversation, is ensuring that the expenditure of public funds under the Colorado Constitution is for a public purpose. Having a third party administer that benefit that would be going to private citizens is helpful in that regard, using those standards. And then also to make sure that they are targeted towards coronavirus relief and having those strict eligibility requirements that would ensure that they are CARES Act eligible. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, sir. Any comments for staff from council members? Councilman Guardiola?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Rogers. What is the eligibility? My big concern is that some of our, that everybody in Karma City that hits that income, is the income the big eligibility, or what else is the requirements?
So eligibility is a big, I will say, an eligibility parameter. The application, once again, we're talking rental and mortgage assistance. Obviously, those are two categorical parameters that would also become applicable to this as well. And those are probably, I would say, the two biggest factors when they're looking at eligibility. Now, there are some, I will say, technical details as it relates to processing and timing of when somebody is also eligible when it comes to, I'll say, are they late with either their mortgage or their rent is another parameter. But some of the biggest, I'll say, parameters that start to get into the issues that we're dealing with are those, but obviously, are they COVID affected and income levels as well? Once again, getting back to that AMI. So that's some of the kind of basic foundational parameters that we are negotiating and working with Maker. And then obviously any city program would have to be obviously different from those if we're looking at concurrent disbursement, or if it's a sequential nature, we can then pattern and mirror after those guidelines to allow for us to effectively reach that broader side.
What about like citizenship and stuff like that?
There's been a discussion as it relates to citizenship, and obviously that's a policy discussion about the application of their dollars. I can't speak to I'll say the CARES Act that's been received from Adams County, I haven't been able to, quite frankly, jump into the particular details as to whether or not it's permitted for those who are of a citizenship of the United States or not. That's something that we would have to work with, obviously, with the city manager's office and legal counsel to be able to understand the application of those funds in that manner. I can say that we could assist a household that is up to 3 months, or we could look at other funds that could assist. I'll say non-HUD funds that could not assist for that, but there's a lot of uniquities around this that we would have to truly dig into to be able to provide some true feedback to you on that.
I just, yeah, definitely. And I appreciate that, because I think if this is something for all residents of Commerce City, because all residents of Commerce City, regardless of citizenship, pay gas taxes, pay King Soopers taxes, and federal taxes, to be honest with you. I think they should, if we're going to do this for all of Commerce City, it should be something that all of Commerce City residents that live in our city that have been affected should be able to apply for. And I think that that's a huge population in Commerce City that's often forgotten. So if you could get back to us on that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Jason, do you know how many households we're talking about?
Just using some round estimates, as we've been talking with Maker Housing Partners with the CDBG dollars, the 200,000 would be able to support in the range of, on low end 80, high end of 100 homes. So as you think about doubling and almost half of that, you could probably, extrapolate the impact to being a typical number of, if we're doing 100 at 200,000, possibly 200 at 400, 500,000. We haven't had that direct communication with Maker. I think because one of the things that I would like to communicate in some of the feedback that we've received is that if we are diverting from the eligibility parameters of our third-party vendor, they may not be able to take on the administration of the program, given that they are looking at trying to have a streamlined process that will allow for them to effectively administer, review, and then disperse those funds. I will say, as we've continued our negotiations with Maker, it's become very apparent to us that once it's souped and nuts with an application, it will take at least a month for a check to go out the door, just because of the amount and the volume of work that they have with the streamlined process and parameters that they have in place. Once we start to, once again, divert from that, they may say we don't have the capacity to help administer, and then we're looking at our second and third option in being able to assist with moving the program forward.
I had a follow-up. Several $1 million came to us from the county through the CARES Act. How is it that we arrived at 200,000? Could it be higher?
So we had a direct appropriation from Housing and Urban Development in the amount of 246,000 for us to be applied to various CDBG office functions and or being able to establish a program to assist those that are affected by COVID. The reference of the CARES Act funding that you make mention of obviously is a different pot of money, which at the May 28th meeting, there was a discussion to look at another appropriation that would then bring the 200,000 plus this 500,000 up to 700,000 in direct support to our residents. But those are two different pots of money.
So they're not available for the mortgage and rental assistance? I don't understand.
So we have 200,000 directly from HUD that will be put towards directly mortgage and rental assistance. We have 500,000 that was moved by City Council that will also be able to be applied to mortgage and rental assistance.
So then we're talking about $746,000.
700,000 because we have to keep back a portion of the 246 for administrative functions, both externally and internally for the CDBG program.
So that would be a few more than 100 people then probably.
So, right. So when I was using the 100 people, that was assigning it to the $200,000 direct disbursement. If you look at going with the additional 500,000, you're possibly looking at helping another 200 people on top of the 100. I can't confirm that. That's just a simple mathematical extrapolation that I'm doing with the amount of dollars to how we're impacting with Maker. And we would have to look into that with obviously who we would select as a vendor and being able to serve our administration needs. And
I know.
I would like to share with you, we do have Cheryl Steinberg on board who can talk about the immigration status and how certain funds could be applied in a direct response to Councilmember Guardiola.
And I appreciate Councilmember Guardiola's suggestion a while ago about, I think, a universal payment, if you will. And if you thought about the number of households, I don't know, it just seems to me like it could go further. So I hope that's the case. I know this was Mayor Huseman's suggestion, and I'm sure he has many questions, so I won't say anymore.
Yeah, Jason, I had a question as well, and thank you for the presentation. But in that last slide, you mentioned a possible vendor helping. I was just curious, how would the vendor be picked? And then like, what would their job title be? Thank you.
You're welcome. So obviously there are, I'll say a select few or a number of vendors that are currently operating within the market today that is providing mortgage and rental assistance. Given the flexible nature and us being able to go through a policy and a process to select a vendor, which is outside of our normal practice, we're able to have direct communication. So I'll say, for the lack of better words, a sole source with who's able to meet the eligibility parameters that we establish at the city level. Once again, even though that we may establish eligibility parameters A, the third party vendor may have eligibility standards B, and may not be able to accommodate. So partly what we are doing is our due diligence to understand who may be able to satisfy our need. That may be one, that may two, that may be three, that may be none at all. And then be able to bring that information back to you, because there may be the differences as to the amount of administration fee that they need to administer that program on our behalf. When they serve as an administrator, obviously we enter into a contract with them to serve as, for lack of better words, an extension of city staff in reviewing applications and being able to make sure that they meet the strict eligibility requirements that are tied to the federal funding that's been received, but also to ensure that they are ensuring that those who are applying to us are COVID affected and meet the various income eligibility parameters, and obviously meet our eligibility parameters as well. We will then work very closely with said administrator from a monitoring and a reporting as it relates to bids and making sure that their files, when we have to be able to report to HUD, we have the proper documentation to demonstrate, obviously, as the big thing that we shared tonight, that there's not been a duplication of services or benefits, and that they've been able to meet those basic requirements. I would go further to say one of the things that we've shared as well about Maker being a potential partner. Maker is ultimately also already serving Commerce City residents currently in a very similar program. However, since we don't have a funding amount into that program, we're not able to earmark for our residents as a specific amount for them to be able to go to, as opposed to a general amount that currently exists within their program funding.
Okay, all right, thank you. So then it's not determined yet how much they'll be paid possibly yet, right? Is that correct? Or
so for Maker, we have a general estimate about what their administration fee is. Typically with this type of application or administration or process, they look at a 20% administration fee that comes out of the program itself. We've been able to work with Maker to negotiate that down to 10% as it relates to the application of the CDBG funds, so that we can still, once again, maximize the direct impact to our residents. But once again, that's just one option, where other options such as Salvation Army may have a different administration fee and different parameters that may be more suitable to what we're looking for on the city program.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments or recommendations for staff regarding this?
Do we have any estimate of the need yet?
No, we do not. I mean, we've, once again, as we've talked with Maker Housing Partners as it relates to what they've seen as the existing need, that's what we've been able to understand kind of comes to that 80 to 100 families. And it's our understanding that that is a growing need day by day. We don't have direct analytics for me to be able to give to you what that exact number is, but from our conversation, it is multiple households that are impacted and that we would be able to serve.
Yeah, I was just asking, more ballpark would it be better to keep it at 80% AMI and try to help as many households as possible, would we be able to distribute all the money that way, or would it be more beneficial to up the AMI and try to have a concurrent disbursement based off of the need that we're seeing? Because I think I'm leaning more trying to help as many households as we can and trying to do a sequential disbursement and keeping things streamlined at that 80% so people can get assistance quicker.
I think the deadlines that are out there, this money needing to be paid by December versus the CDBG, Community Development Block Grant funds that can go up till 2022, I think determines how we stagger this to go. I think that following the same rules of criteria, be it an 80% AMI and people who have been directly impacted through reduced wages or lost jobs or layoffs, furloughs, whatever case it is, being the people that we want to help is a smart way to go. I think originally the idea was let's use the CDBG money first and then let's use city money if we have to. This really isn't city money. This is CARES funding that was dispersed to Adams County and then through Adams County to us that came out of the CARES Act. So this isn't actually city money. So my recommendation would be that we go use ours first, the $500,000. If Maker wants to go down to 10%, I have no issue with letting an outside vendor do that. I think that also provides good insulation so that nobody can come back and say, oh, well, Commerce City didn't support me, but they supported so-and-so. It's clearly separate from us so that we don't have to worry about that, similar to how we operate the Quality Community Foundation, so that we don't have any conflict of interest there. So for me, 80% AMI, anybody that's been affected through reduced wages, reduced hours, furloughs, or layoffs, or complete losing a job directly related to the COVID-19 crisis, because that's where the money comes from, and administered by Maker is the way to go. And then if we need to continue through, then we use that CDBG money to continue to help people who are still not fully recovered from all this. As you know, a lot of businesses are not coming back and jobs are kind of running scarce to have right now. So that's my opinion. Anybody else have a differing opinion that wants to give direction to staff? But I think that's the way that we should go.
Yeah, Jason, I forgot to ask one other question. Like, is there a requirement or is it in the guideline when it says an individual? Is it one per household, or is there going to be a limit per household how many individuals can apply?
It would be it's my understanding, and it's per household, not per individual per household, because obviously, and then I think as our administrator would cross-reference, addresses, we want to make sure that we're then obviously not getting into duplication of services. And that's where that administrator comes in with their strict review of the application, the eligibility requirements, and making sure that they are applying those funds correctly, that we are making sure, or they are making sure on our behalf that we are remaining overly compliant with I'll say the federal guidelines and or HUD requirements.
Jason, you said, sorry, you said Cheryl was on the line to answer the question?
Yes, about if there's an ability to assist legal or illegal as it relates to from an immigration perspective. So I do have her on the line so that she can provide some clarity.
Hi, Councilman, this is Cheryl.
Yeah.
Yes, the CDBG funds are required to ask the question about documentation. But this is where it brings up the benefits of a third party partnering with another agency, because they often get, and for example, Maker does have other funds available that do not require that question to be asked. So should they encounter that situation, they could not use our funds, but use other funds to take care of those families and those households in the city.
Okay.
May I also add, I don't know that these terms would be the same, but looking at Adams County's program that they're doing through Maker, I assume would have similar criteria that we'd use to answer Ms. Allen Thomas's question. I think the household question would come up when they determine the average, the household income to see if they get within that 80% AMI. They'd look at the whole household, and there are limits on kind of the amount of rent to make sure it's not an excessive rent. As well as reapplying up to 3 times in a 6-month period for 3 times total. So they go through a pretty detailed, and we may have different standards, but I think they have that expertise. And Mr. Guardiola, as far as citizenship, the reason I think they ask that in part is when you're determining AMI, you have to look at a lot of documents, including perhaps a W-2 and various items. So that legality of residence probably would come up in that anyway.
Sure. Hey, thanks, Robert. I'm just curious too, will it be, or Jason, you might know too, will it be in English and Spanish?
It is my understanding that they operate the program that is bilingual, both in Spanish and in English.
Okay, and what about interpreters if they need that also?
I believe they also have interpreters as well to be able to assist with the need to be able to provide the bilingual services.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, so any objections to anything that's been said so far? Staff, you have direction going forward on how to go?
Yes, sir. And I think just as a point of clarity, Robert, given that we've already made a budget appropriation to receive the CARES Act funding from Adams County, obviously, there's no need for us to bring another ordinance forward with respect to that. But I do believe we will need to have an item as it relates to our at least recognizing our partnership with Maker as it relates to the administration of this program that we would have to bring forward to council.
Probably. The money is appropriated into the general fund, so we'll just have to look at what that vehicle is to direct that. So it'll probably be on the agenda for next weekend at a minimum for a motion directing that, if not a resolution.
All right. Any other conversation on this item before we move on? Great. Thank you very much for all the work that's gone into putting that together. Hopefully we can impact the lives of some of our residents in a positive manner. Next on the agenda is reports. Mr. Smith, would you like to provide a Suncor update?
Sure. Thank you, Mayor. I also have an update for you related to the potential for a third round of the small business loans as a result of Mr. Hurst's motion at the last council meeting. Michelle Claymore was going to present some material that I sent to you earlier today in an email, but apparently the wind has knocked out her internet connection. So she's working to restore that. So I'll start with Suncor, and if she doesn't join us, then I will just continue and I'll present the information for you related to the business grant criteria. So following the meeting last Monday night, there were a few things that we were able to do. Again, attempting to refine and adjust and address council's requests related to providing new information for Suncor. The two issues are first, the report of activities and abnormalities that occur at the plant. We do receive monthly updates from Suncor, and we will continue reading those updates to the council when we get them. And once a quarter, we have Suncor come do an in-person presentation that includes that and other key issues. The settlement agreement that Suncor entered into with CDPHE and the bill that Aaron Goff referred to earlier tonight both address a very similar issue related to reporting community notifications. So Suncor is required by their settlement agreement to build out a community notification system similar to, I believe, what the mayor has been requesting, so that residents or really anyone could subscribe to information from Suncor and will get notifications immediately when there's some sort of an incident that occurs at the Suncor refinery. That project is going to take them some time to build out in perpetuity, as I understand it from meeting with them following Monday's meeting. And so in the interim, what I've asked Suncor to do is to place subscriber information on their website that would allow residents to sign up for the very same communications that you all receive when those things happen at the plant. The email list, the distribution list that they have today is representative of stakeholders, as it's called, the stakeholder communication that they have defined. So that's all members of the city council, some members of staff, county commissioners, some people in the city and county of Denver. And my request was to have their IT department open up subscriber information on their website and allow others to sign up for those communications. They're working on whether or not that's an option or an alternative for them. And I have a follow-up meeting scheduled with them and our communications folks later this week. In the meantime, we have done a couple things to try to bridge the gap in the in-between period, understanding what the mayor was trying to accomplish with his request. And we have reposted and retweeted social media information that Suncor has shared with us. And we do have, as the mayor's described, an alert for other things that people have signed up for. And that subscriber list has a little over 600 people on it. So we sent the latest communication about additional flaring activity to those 600 folks. We didn't hear anything back from them, whether it wasn't what they signed up for. So our plan is to continue to do that as they come in. We have not been able to build a specific link or an alert to the Suncor information, but those are the steps staff has taken since the last meeting to attempt to, continue to refine our ability to address the requests from council. I wanted to go over those tonight with you all and offer the opportunity for you to give us more feedback, to refine those, to better meet your needs. But those are the things that we have in place today to try to address these requests that council have had. So I'll stop there and see if there's any feedback for me.
Any feedback from council regarding what Mr. Smith has addressed?
Can I raise hands, or are we raising hands or just unmuting, Mayor?
Just unmute and talk.
Hey, Troy, thanks for that update. How tough is it? Like, are we going to need somebody on call 24/7 to update that website, or were you guys able to do without those 600 subscribers? Was it pretty quick and easy, painless update?
Well, fortunately, the incident that did occur with the additional flaring activity that we learned of the day after the council meeting occurred during business hours. So when we have staff on duty, if you will, we're able to do, we are able to do all of those things, and we regularly do all of those things. When another entity, if Adams County has an incident that occurs, we retweet or repost that. So that's sort of within our normal range of operations and things we already were doing. The sending to the 600 subscribers was new. And again, we did that in an attempt to, address the the concern as best we could about getting that information out. If we receive the information in an after hours situation, then we're going to repost the next business day. So if it happens on Friday at 5:05, it won't go out till Monday morning from us. Suncor is up there at my request during this meeting I had with them last week. They've upped their social media content, they tell me. So they are communicating more on Facebook and Twitter and those things. And residents and council members can certainly subscribe to Suncor's Facebook page, and that is a great source of information.
Thank you very much for responding to our questions and desires in the last week. Really appreciate it very much.
Of course. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that was my intent, was to understand the expectation, or to level the expectation for us that you will get that message out. But if it's after hours, at this current point, we will do it as soon as you guys are back in office, available to do so. But moving forward, if we can find solutions where it's more automated and it's not dependent on business hour, I think that's the goal, right? But I appreciate you guys kind of bridging that gap and looking for a solution until we can find a permanent one.
You bet. And that's why I wanted to make the report. I think the best possible solution is what's in the settlement agreement. And that is that Suncor develops their own system for reporting this information out to community members, and we're not passing it on. There's no way for us to verify, the information. And I think it's best to come from the entity that's generating the information. But until then, we're going to do everything we can to help meet the requests that council had. And so that was the point of my update tonight, was to let you know the steps that our communications division has taken to try to do that.
Well, Troy, I think we're getting a double dose of it too right now, because we heard earlier in the legislative subcommittee meeting that the bill that's currently at the Capitol has kind of been toned down to a more what we're talking about right now, to where they're asking, they're expanding the requirements of report out. I know from our residents, discussing this with our residents, they're frustrated that that's not a requirement, and then even further frustrated that that Suncor doesn't take the steps on their own without being required to do so. And so I think that bill at the Capitol is what that has turned into, is kind of what we're all asking for here, is, we'll define the stakeholders, not necessarily Suncor, in terms of is what the state is saying, or what CDPHE and all of their regulators are. I think the hardest conversation to have about Suncor lately is that we don't have a foot to stand on in terms of forcing them to do anything right now, because we're not a regulator of theirs. And so this is, I think, a positive move for, that they're working with us, but on the other side of it, now they're being forced to work with us. So we're kind of double dosing this from the state, from their penalties, and it's all coming together and kind of being forced on them. So I think it's just going to be our job to make sure that is, we have input of that the system that comes out of this is acceptable use for the stakeholders that we feel are necessary to be involved.
The one thing I would add is, the original direction council gave us months ago about reporting more information about Suncor led to me contacting them and having a meeting with them and designing essentially what we have today, right? So the monthly reports and the once a quarter in-person presentation, Suncor jumped on and worked with me to help develop those. So to that end, when we have asked for them to participate in sharing information in this way, in that respect, they have been very good about doing that. On the other hand, the mayor mentioned at the last meeting, he and I met with them, and he asked for them to essentially report everything that they're reporting to CDPHE to us. And they told us they would not do that. They have one regulator in the state, and they're mandated to report there, and they did not want to set up dual reporting relationships between different levels of government. And they also commented that, the county had asked for the same thing. So to that end, I just want to be clear that when I have reached out to them for assistance, I would say they have been willing to share the information, and they jumped on the opportunity to come and present to the council on a quarterly basis and to provide us information once a month.
I want to jump in here for a minute, though. The reporting of incidents that they do is on a public website that city staff can access. So I'll send you the link.
Yes,
all of the incidents are listed there. So if they don't want to send it to you, it doesn't matter. I mean, they are self-reporting, but that doesn't mean that we can't access that information ourselves as well.
Yes, ma'am. And I believe that's the link we've been providing to CDPH.
Actually, yes, that is not the link for the complaints. It's just an overview about Suncor. I'll send you a different link.
Okay, great. We'll add it to the report. Thank you.
Yeah, Troy, thank you for
wait, excuse me for a minute.
I thought you were
Sorry.
done.
I just wanted to say, I want the staff to provide it to us. I don't want people to have to look it up. We're back to that again. That wasn't the intent.
We will read, as you've requested, we will read the incidents that are reported during our report out at the council.
Yeah. Are you done, Susan? Okay. Yeah, thank you, Troy. I just wanted to ask too, and just I think I mentioned it before, but I just was concerned because I was a resident when the Suncor exploded before, and so I just have a concern. Like on Friday, if an incident or an explosion occurs on a Friday afternoon or Saturday, how can residents be notified? Waiting that amount of time if there's an occurrence that occurred. So can staff, possibly look into something maybe similar like the tornado warning signal or something like that? Because what are residents supposed to do, during that period of time if it occurs after hours? And then another concern, can city staff explore the possibility for a lot of the residents that don't use the internet, putting it in the some type of way of notifying everyone of complaints in the city newspaper as well? Thank you.
So yeah, the kind of reporting that Suncor does on their stakeholder communications that you all receive are typically about increased flaring. If there was an emergency response, a fire, an explosion, it was the example you gave. Our police department and the fire district would be engaged in that response, and they would bring with them all of their tools for working that incident, and that would include notification of residents who would be impacted by that, including the reverse 911 system, provided that the emergency met the criteria for its use. So there are different kinds of communications. This tool that I'm describing is not intended for emergency response kinds of situations. In response to sharing additional information outside of the methodologies I've described, I'll have to take back and work with staff on, if we were to dedicate some sort of space in our connected newspaper that we send, a newsletter we send, or that there are some other things we might be able to do, but currently we don't do those things.
All right, thank you.
So, Mr. Smith, first I want to say thank you. Thank you for sending that email out last week that about the increased flaring and using the system. I think that you've proven that it can work. Yes, we do have some limitations as far as whether or not we have people on working at the time whenever the message comes in and whether or not those can get out. But of course, based on the severity, somebody can always log into the system and make sure that gets pushed out. So I do appreciate you guys using that. Further compounds my request that we have administrative subdivision cases as well as land use cases and zoning cases and stuff also be able to go out through the same system. One of the comments that Councilwoman Noble made this evening is, if a well permit comes up and it's administratively approved and that flies under the radar because the majority of residents out there don't know it's coming up or don't know that they have their opportunity to speak regarding it, I think that shows a further need for using this system to get out there. At the same time, if we're only having 697 people subscribe to this service out of a resident population of about 60,000 people, then maybe we need to be marketing the service a little bit better. One of the things I continually say is whenever you go to the website and you see that little icon, you have no idea what the icon means. So maybe changing that icon to sign up for city alerts, maybe putting an email blast out, maybe doing some social media, maybe encouraging more people that, hey, this is a way to stay informed that goes beyond having to watch council meetings, that goes beyond having to go on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and all those other things. This is your opportunity to stay informed. And there's a lot of good information that does come out of that. Like I said, I signed up for it shortly after moving to Commerce City. I still receive those emails. I just think that it's a great opportunity, but we need to tweak it a little bit in order to make it more useful for our residents. And we need to probably, a quick little video that shows this is how you sign up for it so that people know and some of the information that they can be assured to receive whenever that happens. So I think it's a great step in the right direction. I appreciate you guys listening to what was said last week and actually taking action in order to solve an issue that is probably overcomplicated by different people putting out different ideas, but you guys got it done, so thank you very much for that.
Yeah, if I could just add, Mayor, to your point, I've been working with our IT director, who's also on the line here, Justin Bingham, at a budget proposal that will be coming your way in 2021 to replace our customer relations management software with a much more robust system that would include giving the city the ability to have a widget app that residents could download on their phone. And the city then would have permissions as people download that to do push notifications to the residents who subscribe. And that would address any number of potential issues that the council has talked to us about in the past in terms of increasing our ability to communicate directly with residents and real-time information. It's not a cheap solution, but we have done quite a bit of work and research because of the challenges you just described with our current system. And I really believe that this tool could be an incredible communications tool, not only for staff, but also for the city council to get these kinds of words out to the community. So look forward to a much more robust and enhanced budget presentation in that regard.
And you and I have talked in the past about a Commerce City app that would allow that to happen. And I think when you consider some of the hazards that we have around us with our proximity to the airport, our proximity to the rail lines, the amount of truck traffic we coming through, the ability to get in touch with people and pass out important information as quickly as possible is more critical now than ever, especially everything we're seeing taking place down in Denver and the situation down there. So I greatly appreciate you guys working through that. I think that's a great thing that we can all look forward to exploring and seeing how that will work better for us to keep the residents more informed. Before we move on from your part, Councilman Hurst, you wanted to speak?
No, I'll good job, because I think that's the direction we need to go. And really what Mayor Huseman was saying is that's our opportunity to move our current platform into this century instead of doing newspaper and a little sign at the land use, location. I've been on council a year and I've never done either. So I should care, and so to be honest, I think emailing, if we can start transitioning that stuff onto that subscriber list, I'd be in 100% support what Mayor Huseman just said.
So that was my last remark, Mayor. Your request related to land use notifications has not fallen on deaf ears. I will admit it's been a slow moving train, but Mr. Rogers and I have had several conversations about it, and we will continue the dialogue in an attempt to build that out as well.
Thank you. All right, next up, Acting City Manager Tinklenberg, do you have a report?
I actually have one more item.
Okay.
You want me to go, Roger? Or?
Go.
Okay. My last item, Mayor, was the information I sent to the council today with respect to the small business information requested at the last meeting. Just a quick financial summary. The city's CARES Act funding allocation from the county is a total of $4.6 million. We received our first 1/3 distribution totaling $1.5 million on the 5th of this month, and we've submitted a report for expenditures totaling almost $1 million of those dollars. It's anticipated that estimated expenditures total $2.6 million for additional items related to COVID for the city. So the remaining funds estimated to be about $1 million in total of CARES Act related information. I did include in your email the council's total investment to date in community-based programs of about $1.9 million. There are some of those funds, not a lot of them, but some of those funds that are not CARES Act dollars, but that has been your directed community-based program allocation to date. We do have some criteria for you related to small businesses that Michelle Claymore is going to provide for you. And as you're listening to this presentation, I just want to reiterate to the council that opening up another round to assist businesses could be a great thing for the community. In our discussions amongst staff about regulating home-based businesses, it could get very difficult. If you know a number of entrepreneurs, who have home-based businesses that have other jobs, that this isn't their primary source of income, I don't think those were the kinds of things that council was talking about. So any additional direction you can provide us about specifically identifying the types of businesses that you may want to call out or assist would greatly help us in crafting additional criteria from what you're going to see here from Michelle to make the best funding decisions in alignment with your goals that we could. With that, I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you, Deputy City Manager Smith. Good evening, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, and City Council members. Dylan, hopefully you can put up the presentation I sent earlier. I'd like tonight to talk about some of the programs that we are working with as it relates to business assistance. And particularly, there is a proposal out to join what's called the Adams County Safe and Open campaign. A lot of communities around the country are doing a campaign like this. And what it does is basically it helps our small businesses with two things. One, provide technical assistance so that they understand what the rules and regulations are around reopening their businesses, given the guidelines from the state. But two, also to help them market to their customer. Their customers might come back once, but they're not going to keep coming back if they don't feel safe and that the proprietor is really operating in a safe and healthy way. So this ask is for a program to join these efforts, similar to like we did with the restaurants, where we kind of work locally with our own business community, but then it wraps up into a larger county effort where we're providing technical assistance to our small businesses. This program could include toolkits. It could include posters talking about asking customers to wear masks that small businesses can put in their window. This could include information about opening hours that get posted. It could really be a different variety of things. And so that's why we were asking for the $50,000 for this program. Next slide, please. The next, sorry, let me get caught up with my notes here. The second project for discussion is a possible third round of funding totaling $100,000 for the Small Business Support and Recovery Grant Program, and to have it include home-based businesses. Now, this grant program was first rolled out in April with 2 funding cycles. The program providing bridge financing for qualified businesses in the city until other funding sources could be secured. For example, we were hearing a lot of issues that companies had to wait a long time to get their PPP and EIDL loans processed and get the money. And in the meantime, they had bills that they had to cover. And so this grant was a good way to help bridge that financial need while they were waiting for other programs. The grants could also be used for payroll assistance, insurance, and utility bills. Now, because this money was federal money that came from the CARES Act, it cannot be used to replace income lost due to the closure or to pay back taxes that are owed at the federal, state, or local levels. So, you know, even though they were not able to bring in income because their businesses were closed, any CARES Act funding for grants cannot be used to replace that. Next slide, please. Now, this program initially followed most of the other cities across the country that were offering business grants using CARES Act dollars, in that a business had to have a commercial or an industrial storefront to qualify. And I want to talk a little bit about why that is. The main reasons for this is to really stretch limited grant dollars to assist where it can make the most impact. Businesses in commercial or industrial storefronts typically have a much higher overhead cost for their business than a home-based business would. Also, investing in these companies to support rent payments will help prevent empty storefronts from businesses going out of business. High and visible real estate vacancies in the real estate market will send a very negative message to the market about our community. Next slide, please. So everything in black here is the original guidelines that we published with the first 2 rounds of funding. After the discussion City Council had last week regarding looking at including home-based businesses in a grant program, we reviewed the existing guidelines for the program and what could be added to manage this. First, we tried to find other programs across the country that included home-based businesses in their grant programs. Frankly, we had a hard time finding many to look at. There were a few, but the ones we discovered had very vague guidelines and offered substantially less grant amounts than the $5,000. Second, we looked at what else was out there to support these businesses. Any home-based business could apply for the mortgage assistance program that the previous director talked about with the Maker Partners program. These businesses are also eligible for the PPP, EIDL, and traditional SBA loans, as well as the Commerce City COVID relief microloan programs. There are a multitude of different home-based businesses, so anyone can sell an item online and call themselves a home-based businesses. And we really struggled with that as staff. Without further criteria or guidelines, we are concerned that the city could end up funding a home-based business that was not the initial intent of City Council, and that verifying information from home-based businesses could also be a challenge. We added some suggested guidelines, but staff would really like more direction from City Council on the intent of including home-based businesses and whether Council wants to limit the types of home-based businesses that qualify. Based on last week's comments, we could simply add that the home-based business providing childcare is eligible for a grant and leave the rest of the guidelines as presented for earlier rounds, or we're open to other suggestions. But would love your feedback at this time. Thank you.
Any feedback for staff on that?
Yeah, and the challenge. You know, obviously.
No, we tied.
You can go ahead. That's fine.
No, it's all right.
I understand the challenges. It makes sense, and I understand why we didn't do that. I just think small businesses is our future, right? So a small business definitely has the potential to transition to open real estate, to become a storefront. But the businesses that I've talked to, I use the home daycare as an example. There are tax preparation folks, tax professionals that work out of their home. There are people being impacted by COVID that have proof they've been impacted by COVID, who didn't qualify for PPP, who didn't qualify for other programs that they've got documentation to show why they didn't qualify, or that they at least applied and didn't get chosen. Simply what I was looking for, and I understand there's challenges, and I'd love to hear everybody's perspective on it, but is that us recognizing that there are other businesses out there besides the parameters we put out there. They could be landscaping businesses. They could be a personal trainer. If there is a way for us to deem that they have been COVID-19 affected, where they have lost their ability to perform a business, whether the federal government calls it essential or not, that we want to give them an opportunity for us to help them. And quite honestly, I would be willing to have the discussion to use city money on top of this, just so we don't have to put the strict parameters around it. So that was my idea, is just realizing that the parameters we set were for good reason. I understand the first two rounds and the challenges and how we were trying to be consistent, but on top of that, realizing that the key to our success as a city is kind of building and developing small businesses into more successful and robust businesses to provide services in our city. So just don't want those to get forgotten in this whole situation. There are some, very good businesses that just happen to be small enough to still do them out of their home, but, have aspirations to move up in the business world, if you will, and get a storefront in Commerce City in the future. And right now, there's really nothing to help them get through this tough time.
I was just going to suggest that if they have a business license in good standing, that probably says a lot about the business right there. I wouldn't add any other criteria. I would ask though about like food trucks or food wagons or something like that here in Commerce City, because certainly they've been affected because there aren't events that they can look forward to, the big ticket things that most of these operations rely upon. So I don't know, they're not quite a home business, but they're not a storefront either. So anyone who is not a storefront or anyone who has already received money from us would not be eligible, and you must have a business license in good standing, paid up.
I like the proposal. Honestly, I think that hits it all. To approve or to hit home-based businesses. I think the redlining really helps staff also who's eligible. So I would be in support of the proposal of the third round funding, because it is, if they've received it earlier, they're not eligible. It clearly demonstrates the financial impact, so I would definitely, I would want to remove the home base that they have to apply to Adams County first, just because I think this is where, and I'm up for a compromise on it, but I just think that's another layer of paperwork, of steps that, okay, let me try here, and if I don't get it here, then I could try, and we're losing out on it. I think I would remove the home-based business wanting to must apply to Adams County. I think this is the $100,000 for Commerce City businesses, home-based businesses, food trucks. I spoke to someone that owns a food truck actually in Commerce City, and everything's to their home address, right? So I like what you guys have done with the third round of funding for small business support recovery grants, $100,000. I would be supportive of that with all the recommendations you guys have put there, minus the one that they have to apply to Adams County. That's just, I think it hits it. It hits all our businesses, home-based, food trucks, storefront. So that's just what I think.
Mayor, I would ask if there's consensus on removing that requirement from the council. We'll be happy to do that.
Yeah, I don't like having the requirement to apply through Adams County. So if anybody has an issue with removing that, please speak up. Yeah, strike that from the proposal, please.
Thank you.
Any other comments regarding this issue?
I just have one question. In regards to the mortgage assistance, if someone's receiving that, is there a conflict with the rules and all the criteria that we have to meet? Because we talked about it earlier.
I don't believe there would be a conflict with the way this is written. If you would like there to be a conflict, we would have to add some additional criteria, I think.
I don't know. I'd just be afraid of, double dipping in that sense.
Double dip away.
Yeah, so if you're getting,
It's okay with me if people double dip. There's a lot of need out there.
right? That
We
pays.
could add just the fact, did you apply for that, and just have them check yes or no, just as a little bit of a checkbox.
Well, I think, we're still a little ways away before that money goes out for mortgage assistance, whereas this program can probably hit the street a little bit faster. And, quite honestly, if you've lost income out of that and you're struggling to pay your rent, one of the interesting things, Director Claymore made the comment about, having empty storefronts is bad for an image for a community. And so does having a bunch of homes under foreclosure is bad for the community as well. So I think balancing the
Right,
need
but no other business gets that kind of, no other business would be eligible to receive both those grants, right?
Right. But a business owner who has a storefront that's impacted could also be applying for mortgage assistance as well in order to get funding for their business with the storefront as well as mortgage assistance. So, it goes both ways. But, the more requirements that we put on the front end to make it harder to determine who is eligible and who's not eligible just delays the program implementation and takes longer to get the help out to the community that we need it to.
Right, but we do need to work these things out and not just have something with no rules, right? And then, I think it's something that we have to discuss, right? With being the primary source of income and make sure that we're doing it the right way and it's fair for everyone.
There is, if I may, just offer the concern for either double dipping or over provision of support could be an issue under the CARES Act and commingling if they get later CDBG funds. So as we did with the original program, was ensure some requirements to make sure that the funds were being expended for a proper purpose. And there was some evaluation that the economic support was being provided to address a particular effect of the public health emergency. And I think staff would include that kind of standard in this program. Regardless, I think it's there and they'll evaluate the loss as to whether it's due to the cost of the business interruption versus the loss of just general income overall. A sole proprietor may have more difficulty qualifying essentially in that regard. So it's something that each individual, I don't think you can create a criteria tonight or whenever this program's approved to address each and every one of those. But I think that's one of those provisions that we're going to look at as the CARES Act funding guidance evolves. We get a new bit of guidance on the CARES Act every week or so that changes our understanding of what's eligible and what's not eligible. So if that helps put anybody's mind at ease.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at.
Any other discussion on this item?
I would just say if to make it very clear when we promote this, that home-based food trucks are eligible. I think there is a lot of rumors out there that this and that. I think since we're going the extra effort to do this, to make it very clear that everyone is eligible with these. So that's all I would recommend or suggest.
Any other items? So is council in agreement that we're going to proceed or request staff to proceed with this program? Any objections to that? Everybody good? Okay. Mr. Smith, is that the last you had?
Thank you, Mayor. That concludes my part of Roger's update.
Thank you. Mr. Tinklenberg?
Thank you, sir. Earlier this evening, I sent out an update on the reopening. One of the key items that council members had expressed interest in was the plan for the recreation centers. So that is attached. The stepped plan, Robert informed me that I was given not the most recent version of that. And so as soon as we have that confirmed that we have an updated plan, I will get that out to you. But I know the interest was primarily in the recreation centers. So, and you'll notice as you look at it that it's a phased program basically, because there are different programs, different recreation programs that are available to the public, as well as different areas of the recreation centers that can be made available under different circumstances. Also, in recent weeks, there have been complaints about dust. It started with dust off of 112th Avenue. We actually ended up last week issuing a stop work order to that contractor until they came up with an alternate plan. And so they're working with an alternate plan right now, and they're supposed to be treating 112th Avenue this week. So just wanted you to be aware of that progress. Also, over the weekend, there was a complaint regarding dust coming from south of 104th Avenue affecting, Potomac Farms. And again, we issued a stop work order on that one this morning, and they're to come up with a plan for mitigating that dust because they're not supposed to allow fugitive dust off of their work site. And then had several questions about tree limbs. A number of people have broken tree limbs. Staff this morning worked out a plan with A1 Organics. And so the plan is to have people bring their tree limbs to A1 Organics, and then A1 Organics will charge us a fee per cubic yard of material that comes in. And the reason we decided to go with dropping it off at A1 Organics is to prevent contractors from all over the North Metro area from bringing their contracted work product to us and dumping it for us to dispose of, which has happened in the past. Plus, we had people just dumping trash at the green waste site in the past. So this is a alternate approach to take care of that issue. I would also add that the storm did limited damage at the Buffalo Run Golf Course. The main impact was early closure at the restaurant. So other than that, just some minor damage there. So I will end on a note regarding COVID-19. The number of cases were dropping towards the end of the week. However, this morning we got a state report that reported 11% increase. So it's concerning, and we're certainly not out of the woods, and that's why we're taking a gradual, very careful approach in reopening our facilities. As I mentioned in email last week, we do plan to open the Civic Center Wednesday and Thursday, but it will be by appointment only. And we're attempting to set up software to basically enable people to set up appointments. So again, gradually working out those issues and continuing to focus on that issue. Happy to answer any questions if council has questions for us.
Any questions for staff on that report?
Thank you.
All right, any council members wishing to make a report? Councilwoman Grimes?
I actually had a question for Roger. I was driving on E470 over the weekend coming north back towards 104th, and the dust coming off of the property south of 104th and east of Tower was you could not see the car in front of you on E470. The dust was so thick. And I'm just curious if there's been any other complaints about that area, or if there's something we can do there. I don't think there's active construction, but there needs to be some sort of mitigation because it was creating a danger to traffic on the highway as well.
And you say this was east of E470, south of 104th Avenue?
South of 104th, east of Tower.
East of Tower. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and blowing east across E470.
We will have some check that out. Thank you.
Any other comments for Roger? Any other council members wishing to make a report? All right, seeing none. Just one item. We all received a letter from the pastor at the Nativity Lutheran Church thanking Commerce City for their contribution. They did a food drive on Saturday. They were supposed to open up at 10 a.m. and go till 2 p.m. And there were so many cars lined up outside the facility at 8 o'clock in the morning that they started early. Mayor Pro Tem Frank and I spent some time out there passing out food, and seeing the impact that that money had on the community and the people that came by to get the food was very rewarding. So I do appreciate everybody that has agreed to fund the food banks in our area and continue to support our residents who are struggling as we get through this COVID. I think it's a really good thing that we're doing on that, especially using the CARES Act funding for it. That is all I have for a report. Any comments or rebuttals? Last minute alibis? Seeing none, we will adjourn. We'll see you all Monday evening for our regular council meeting at 6 p.m. Prior to that, the deadline is close of business Friday to get any comments that you want in on the land development code amendments that you would like to have changed. And we will hash those out on the 22nd during our study session then. Any questions? Thank you much. You guys have a good evening, good week. Be safe. We are adjourned.